Throughout the last year, I've been rewatching The Walking Dead and making this retrospective series looking at the bads, the highs, the lows, the goods, stuff that really worked, stuff that didn't work so much, and giving a rating to each season. If you've been following along this series with me, then first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for your support over the year, and you'll also realize that I never did videos on seasons 10 and 11, so if you've seen the rest of the seasons, the rest of the videos, feel free to skip ahead and check out those two final seasons, but for everybody else who hasn't been following along each month, then buckle up. You've got an incredibly long video on your hands, so go ahead and grab some snacks, some drinks, get yourselves all nice and warm and comfy, and enjoy my complete series retrospective on The Walking Dead. Given as how there's only 6 episodes to this season, I'm going to go over each of them one by one. I won't be doing this in the later seasons, just highlighting certain episodes and events that happen, but since this is only 6 episodes and this is the one that started it all, I'll go by episode, and that starts us with Season 1, Episode 1, Days Gone By. Now, there's not much I can say about Days Gone By that hasn't been said already by a lot of people. This episode is up there with, I'd say, like Lost as having the best pilot episode of all time, and everything else can maybe come close, but it's not as good. By itself, this episode works almost like it's the first movie of a series, and everything that we see is so carefully crafted and written to complete perfection. We get to see everything unfold in front of us, and we are told very little, which is one of the #1 rules about screenwriting: show, don't tell. We see how good of friends Rick and Shane are, we see just how insane the world has become, we see that Shane and this woman are together, and then we see, oh, that's Rick's wife. There's so little exposition and explanation in this episode. Really the only bits of this is when Rick and Morgan are talking over dinner, and them talking about the world, what's happened, and all of that is necessary to the plot. There can be good exposition and bad exposition, and this moment right here is an example of good exposition. Rick has no idea what the hell is going on. There's this excellent moment when he gets back to his house and he's literally talking to himself saying, is this even real? Am I here right now? And I think that's such a great scene, and it's a quick scene, because if anybody else was in Rick's situation right here, you'd probably be thinking the exact same thing. So when Morgan is explaining what's happened to Rick, he calls the dead walkers. This is the audience learning things for the first time along with our protagonists, and that is usually a good sign of exposition. Bad exposition is when characters are explaining a situation or something that the audience should already know about, but the dialogue is reminding you of what they're talking about.
The clean slate, where you type in someone's name, date of birth, in a few minutes they're gone.
I mean, you might as well just look at the camera and speak directly to the audience at that point. I think one of the reasons why this episode stands out in particular is the character of Morgan. Thinking about Morgan's role in the greater Walking Dead universe now, it's crazy to see that the popularity of this character stemmed from this episode. Morgan wouldn't become a season regular until years later in the show, making an appearance in only one other episode if you don't count the post-credits scenes or the season 5 finale, yet people became so attached to the character of Morgan and they wanted him back. That's because Morgan had his own character arc in this single episode, and he was written to be such a likable dude. There's plenty of examples of great characters that only appear in a single episode in The Walking Dead, and while Morgan doesn't belong in that category anymore, there was a time that he did, and he was far and away the best character during that time that he was in the category. This episode does what all pilots should do, and that's setup. This episode sets up the characters, their relation to each other, their different goals and motivations, and leaves us on a scene that we want to see the resolution of. This is a perfect episode of not only The Walking Dead, but television in general, and it's easy to see why The Walking Dead became such a hit after this episode premiered. So episode 2, titled Guts, introduces us to a whole new cast of characters who would go on to become the beginning of our group of survivors. Glenn is immediately the favorite of these characters. He's the one who saves Rick, and he's incredibly likable and is somebody who the audience can see themselves as. the everyday pizza delivery boy, kinda nerdy, and still sees the bright side of life despite the situation they're in. There's also characters like Andrea, T-Dog, and Merle that would go on to have a varying amount of screen time and importance. But I think what this episode does so well is highlight the survival aspect of the show. They're in a sticky situation with the walkers surrounding them, and you can really feel that tension and that struggle. You feel so captivated in their survival, and even after watching this show many times over and knowing that they're gonna get out, it doesn't make this episode feel any less tense. It's also funny because our characters get in situations like this countless times over the seasons, but usually they can just run away or find an alternate method of escape. Rarely is there a scene that has as great of tension and buildup as this one does. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The show couldn't sustain the amount of tension for every single Walker Horde encounter, so they differentiated them from here on out, but it doesn't take anything away from this episode and this escape. In episode 3, Tell It to the Frogs, we shift away from the survival horror of the show into more of the character drama portion that the show would later go on to fully embrace. But it's also not like this came out of nowhere. The first 2 episodes built up this reunion between Rick and his family, and also the drama that would be sure to come of it. We get several reunions early on in the episode. This group that we see Shane and Rick's family have also been a part of is the same group that the characters from episode 2 are a part of. So Andrea sees her sister, Morales sees his family, and of course, the reunion of Rick and his family. This is such an excellent scene and a great payoff in just 3 episodes, which goes to show how great these characters are written because we truly care about the things going on in their lives outside of just killing zombies. But now that we're in this camp, we get to see more of the dynamics and the characters that we've briefly seen already. Shane is the one who's more or less in charge of everything. Dale is the old wise mentor. Carol is the helpless and abused housewife. And we also meet this new guy, Daryl Dixon. And this guy seems like he's gonna be a problem. I hope he's not around for too long. Daryl's introductory scene is actually really great. He wonders where Merle is. Shane steps in to tell Daryl that he's not around, but then Rick steps up because he thinks that it's his responsibility to tell him. This is already changing the dynamic of the group because while Shane steps in because he thinks he has to, Rick steps up because it's the right thing to do. So with Rick entering this group, the whole dynamic shifts. He brings an old world mindset into the new world, and this gives a lot of people in the group some newfound hope. And very quickly, this group starts to view Rick as the potential new leader. Leaving Merle behind takes a toll on his conscience, and even though he's just got back to his wife and kids, he takes on the responsibility of somebody else's life, even if it means risking his own life. The others, while they may not even realize it at the time, eventually come to learn that this is somebody that they want looking out for them. This whole exchange of power works out great for some people, but not as well for one person in particular, and that's Shane. The dynamic between Rick and Shane is really at the forefront of the story for the remainder of the season and the entire next season, and there's definitely a reason for that. Andrew Lincoln and John Bernthal play off of each other so well and bring so many different levels to each and every scene that they're in. This was also the start of an aspect that I feel is super underrated in the show, and that's the differing opinions of audience members. As this series goes on, this becomes way more relevant, but especially during this episode and maybe the following one, you feel a little bad for Shane. On one hand, you have some people who think that Shane is a rat bastard for getting with his friend's wife when he was still alive, and on the other hand, people saw Shane as a man who was doing everything he could for his best friend's family and happened to fall in love with Lori, but he had every indication that Rick was dead, and he was even being a good, surrogate father for Carl. These difference in opinions between the audience was my absolute favorite part of watching this show as it went on. Particularly in the seasons 5 to 6 era, almost every episode gave the audience something to debate, and I remember being part of those conversations online, even having them with my friends and family, what was right, what wasn't, and that all really stems from the character drama that was presented in this episode. I also have to highlight the writing, not only of this episode, but of the season in general. Whether it be quick and witty remarks, talks of survival between the characters, or even some of the deep and impactful conversations, each and every scene leaves you on the edge of your seat. to hear what happens next, laugh at a funny remark, or lead you to care more about the character speaking. This is certainly something that the show loses as the seasons go on and more characters are introduced. They just either weren't as impactful as the characters that were introduced here, or the writing for them wasn't as captivating. And of course, it's always great to see Shane beat the ever-living crap out of Ed. Regardless of everybody's opinions on Shane, we can all root for him here in this moment. In episode 4, Vatos, we pick up right where we left off in the last episode, showing the effects of the apocalypse and how it impacts different people back at the camp, and the group in Atlanta trying to find Merle and get the guns back when they run into trouble with another group of survivors. Given what the show becomes, the storylines in this episode feel very restricted and almost a little bland, but once again, when you combine the tension of the mission and the excellent dialogue between the characters, this apparently bland synopsis is elevated to one of the best episodes of the season. We also get to see the first group outside of the one that we've seen, and just how far society has dissolved. This episode is, of course, a glimpse into the future of the show, where people would become the main threat and zombies would be secondary. The dilemma presented in this episode is a good one. The Vatos want the guns to protect their own, but so does Rick, and it seems that these people aren't the greatest at first glance, threatening to kill Glenn, but then we find out it's the exact opposite. These people are actually just keeping a retirement home up and running, so they eventually see eye to eye. On one hand, this misdirection is really great and makes sense that there would still be some good people left in the world to care for others, but on the other hand, I feel like this card was played too early. Getting to see a nastier side of the world when it comes to humans would be a great introduction to what the world is like now, and we're told that there's been some plunderers that the Vatos have run into, but so far, every single human that we've seen is basically nothing but a good person, maybe outside of Merle. I almost wish that this misdirection of an enemy group of people was saved for later, but as it stands, this is still a great episode. Back at the camp, we also see that being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, is actually not a great place to hold out, and the group now has to find a new home after an attack that leads to the end of a lot of people's lives. This is also the first time that we see the group full-on fight off a group of walkers. They've only really run away from them before this, and this is also, of course, a trend that would continue in the years to come. In episode 5, Wildfire, it shows us the aftermath of what the attack does to our group mentally, the full change in group dynamics between Rick and Shane, and the conversations regarding where they should go next. This is another episode that highly focuses on the group dynamic and the different personalities clashing in the zombie apocalypse. Things like Rick suggesting that they go to the CDC to get the cure, Glenn yelling that they bury their dead, they don't burn them, and Jim trying to hide his bite from everybody, hoping that it'll just get better. These different conversations and even storylines in the show are clear signs that this is the first season of the show. Bites don't just get better, not everybody is able to get buried, and there is no cure. This episode is really focused on furthering the development of our characters, see how this adversity affects each and every member of the group. People like Andrea absolutely crumble at the death of a loved one, while Carol is not too deeply affected. This is also the first ever scene between Daryl and Carol, which turns out to be a very important friendship that's continued on into present day. In this episode, the group fully embraces Rick's ideology, and the torch is unwillingly passed from Shane to Rick. Shane wanted to go to the military base, Fort Benning, away from the city in hopes that a military base would still have all the supplies that they need, whereas Rick wants to go to the CDC in hopes that it's still up and running and they can get a cure for Jim. I think these two choices perfectly reflect the characters of Rick and Shane at this time in the show. Shane is a realist. He wants to do what's best for them right now, in that moment, the people who are still alive, and go to a place that's proven to have more weapons and fortification. Rick is an idealist. He still has hope that maybe the CDC is up and running and they'll have a cure for this thing, even if that's just a long shot. Ultimately, hope wins out, even with some skepticism from Lori, who maybe He thinks that Shane is correct, and this is also set up for how big of a wrench Lori throws in between Rick and Shane in season 2. But the group goes to the CDC, drops off Jim on the way, and we meet Dr. Edwin Jenner. In the season finale, TS19, we see the group enter the CDC, and I've done a more in-depth analysis of this episode in the past, so if you want to hear my full thoughts on that, I'll leave the link up for it in the corner right now, but I have a lot of mixed feelings on this episode. For one, as a season closer, I do think that it was the right direction to go in. The CDC seems like the ultimate best place to be, especially with how it's depicted in this episode, but as an episode that ends a season of a show that would go on for over a decade, I feel like this was too early. Finding out more about the virus, that there's no cure, that there really is no hope in the world, it all seems like territory that could have and should have been covered in later seasons. But as I say that, hindsight is 2020. They had no idea how big of a hit that the show would be, that it would last as long as it has, and I think that the show got progressively better over the next few seasons, so changing all of seasons 2 to 6 just so that way they can go and visit the CDC is not really something that I would have wanted. But later than that, seasons 9 to 11 could have been interesting if it wasn't an avenue that they already visited. On its own, this is still a great episode. What sticks out to me here is the structure of the episode. The first half of the episode is all about bringing this place up. We walk in, see how great this place potentially is. They all have hot showers, a nice dinner with lots of wine. Even Glenn with a hangover here is better than being out in the world. But at around the halfway mark, we learn more about the virus, test subject 19 being Jenner's wife, and the second half of the episode is all about bringing this place down. The electricity runs out, they're out of fuel, and ultimately leads to the CDC literally exploding and leaving our group on the road. It's a real shame too, because if not for this doomsday counter and fuel being a finite resource, the CDC would absolutely be the best place to live in the zombie apocalypse. The season introduces us to our group, establishes the world and the rules that it follows, and sets up a lot of plot lines for the future of the show. If this series had not done well and this was the only season we got, it wouldn't even be close to a complete story. I mean, I still don't think we have a complete story even all these years later, but with the storylines introduced here, we wouldn't have gotten any semblance of conclusion. So now I think is a good time to talk about a few of the things in this season that don't really hold up when looking at it in retrospect. For one, I obviously have to talk about the zombies themselves. These walkers aren't even really walkers at all. They have the capability to run at you, to try and climb ladders, and even some of their memory. After the first episode and the first season in general, the walkers wouldn't do anything like this until the back half of season 11, and even that was just to try and call back to the zombies from the first season. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I know and understand that completely, but it's still just such a strange choice to have the zombies' behavior change so drastically when it was a big focus in these early episodes. I also find it strange that there's so many different names for the zombies, yet both Morgan and the Atlanta Survivor Camp just so happen to call them walkers. Maybe that was their official name when the news first broke out, but I find it awfully coincidental if it wasn't. Maybe that's a bit nitpicky, but there's also a lot of evidence that the show was setting things up that eventually never happened. There's a scene with Rick and Andrea in the store, and they're kind of doing a bit of flirting, possibly setting them up to eventually get together like in the comics, and this scene would have been pointed to as the first initial setup for it, but this, of course, never came to fruition. But there's also an equal amount of setup that eventually did get payoffs. All the Rick vs. Shane stuff, what Dr. Jenner whispered to Rick, Merle escaping Atlanta, all of this stuff does get brought back up, so while there were some training wheels on for this first season, when the wheels came off, a lot of the stuff that was highlighted did come back for the future. This season, and this show in general, is a character drama disguised as a zombie survival show. It's always been about the characters and how they navigate this world, not about getting food to survive or finding a good base to hold out in. All that stuff is secondary when it comes to The Walking Dead. There might be an episode 2 about getting food, or it might be a plot point leading to some other storyline, but it's never been the main focus, which I feel like turns some people off when it becomes the soap opera with zombies, as some people so lovingly refer to it as. While the season had a higher emphasis on the survival against the zombies, it's still about the characters. Seeing Rick say things like, "We don't kill the living," or Carol apologize to Ed after he's the one who hit her, and Daryl being really antagonistic towards Rick Grimes, all goes to show where these characters start, and eventually where they end up and who they end up becoming. That being said, the season did have an emphasis on two things that the show would later lose: survival and horror. The survival aspects come from the conversations of where to go for safety, traversing the world, and getting rid of the walkers, and the horror, of course, comes from the walkers themselves. While the show would never completely shed these aspects from the story, they wouldn't be nearly as relevant. But that's also not a bad thing. People eventually grew tired of the constant moving from place to place and the cheap jump scares from the walkers, so the show needed to grow in order to maintain its audience. So the show did grow, in some areas better than others, and that leads us to season 2. The first season of The Walking Dead does just about everything right upon first viewing, but in retrospect, it does have some flaws. So because of that, it's hard to give this season a rating. When I first saw it, it was a pure 10 out of 10, but as this video is a retrospective, I have to take the nostalgia out of it, so I'm gonna go with the final score of a 9 out of 10. One of the things about season 2 that stuck out to me immediately was how big of a threat the walkers were. The herd passing through in episode 1 was genuinely nerve-wracking and such a tense and excellent scene. One walker was a tall task for Andrea to handle. Rick tells Sophia to stay put so he can take out 2 walkers, which ends up being a very bad idea. But at this point in the show, 2 walkers really did seem like a tall task. Now there's also the sense that our group is still new to this game, they aren't leveled up enough to take these things on with confidence, and getting comfortable and skilled at killing walkers all becomes part of their individual character growth, but there's still the Frank Darabont factor with these walkers. They were still monsters at this point, not just obstacles in the way. The dialogue is all around far superior than the first season. They fully lean into the character drama, which puts some people off because it wasn't the parts of the first season that they liked, but when it comes to the character arcs of this season, it's very clear this was the direction the show was always going to go in. Binge watching this season makes it not at all boring, but I feel like more compelling because the pacing is so much better. From this season onward, The Walking Dead feels like a streaming show, meaning it feels like a show that all the episodes were released at once and it was meant to be binge watched. In a lot of ways, I feel like this season in particular was really ahead of its time. There's a few characters who get an increased role this season, one of which is Daryl. The way they utilize Daryl in this season is excellent, and it's easy to see why Daryl started becoming the standout character and fan favorite. It's super impressive writing because they gave Daryl the only storyline that really worked for him to have, and that's to find Sophia. In the comics, Sophia never goes missing, and there's no such thing as Daryl. So to have such a big deviation from the comics this early on only worked if the audience cared about what's going on, and having this side character, who we didn't have the greatest opinion of at first, go out of his way to search for this girl that really doesn't mean anything to him, means everything to the audience. Daryl doesn't have a ton of lines, doesn't do a lot of talking, but his actions are far louder than anything he could possibly say to anyone. Chupacabra is a particular standout episode for Daryl, where he finds Sophia's doll and hallucinates the vision of Merle as he's injured trying to get back to the farm. He still does some, I'll say, uniquely Daryl things.
Look, he's wearing ears.
But ultimately becomes a very likable character. As the season goes on in the second half, Daryl is used as another wedge between Rick and Shane, because Rick goes to look at Daryl as his right-hand man instead of Shane. Less is more with Daryl, it always has been, always will be, and they really understood that in this season. Carl also has an increased role, playing the annoying kid who wants to grow up too fast, and for that role, I think that he plays it well. His injury is really what sets the season in motion, the reason for them staying at the farm, Shane's derailment, and basically everything else that happens because our characters are forced to stay at the farm. He's a naive kid who doesn't have either one of his parents keep a close eye on him, so this eventually leads him to do what kids do, mess shit up. But honestly, watching this season, I had a lot of sympathy for Carl. He loses his only friend in the world and then wants to grow up to help out the others, but they don't really want him him to, so he goes and does his own thing. I think this season sets up Carl to go on a nice character arc of his own in a few years. The seeds were all being planted here, even though they eventually took the character in a completely different direction, but I'll go over that when that time comes. Glenn gets an increased role because of his storyline with Maggie. There's winners and losers in the zombie apocalypse, people who end up better off than they were before, and people who can't handle the new world, and it eventually literally consumes them. And then there's Glenn, the nerdy pizza delivery boy who ends up getting Maggie. Now, a lot has been said about the Glenn and Maggie relationship, about how lucky he is, but those conversations died down over the years because everybody realized that Steven Yeun is a very handsome guy, and Glenn goes on to shed this pizza delivery boy personality. But I need to bring it back up, because back in season 2, this was not Glenn. This was not Glenn, and this was certainly not Glenn. Glenn was each and every one of the lonely nerds watching this show, a character we could all see ourselves as, and for him to get a girl like Maggie, he was a goddamn hero. So for that, I salute you, Glenn. But there's only one reason why this relationship works, and it is believable as it is, and that's the chemistry between Steven Yeun and Lauren Cohen. These two end up becoming such an unlikely yet beautiful pairing, and it's one of the only breaths of happiness in this season, and really for seasons to come. Talking about season 2, I obviously have to mention Herschel, played by the late Scott Wilson. Herschel is easily the best character introduced this season. He starts the season off doing everything he can to help our group, being a man of God and still praying for the world. But as the season goes on, his secrets are uncovered, and we learn that Herschel isn't all that aware of how bad the world is. He thinks of the walkers as people still, and that kind of thinking just ends up getting you killed. By the end of the season, Herschel is a changed man, and even though he's changed his mindset in a few ways, he becomes the moral compass and really the dad of the whole group. Scott Wilson was an excellent actor and elevates every single scene that he's in, and I truly cannot give him enough praise. We get to see a few different flashback scenes from before the apocalypse, which is always cool to see our characters before we really met them on screen and how they eventually got where they are. The first one is Shane telling Lori what happened to Rick while she's waiting to pick up Carl from school. Lori's talking to one of her friends about her marriage with Rick and how things aren't going too smooth. It's really the inverse of the opening scene in the pilot of Rick talking to Shane about his marriage with Lori. But this time it's not like seeing two different sides of the argument. What Rick was saying about how Lori said something so cruel in front of Carl and how he'd never say that was exactly what Lori said to her friend and how she was wrong for saying it. Then Shane shows up, tells her about Rick and how he's been shot, and she realizes that the last conversation that she had with her husband was not a great one, and now she has to tell Carl. We also get to see the first bombing of Atlanta, and really how the group all met each other on the highway in the first place. But mostly what these scenes are setting up is Shane's involvement with Rick's family. At the start of the season, there is an internal struggle in Shane. He's in love with Lori, but he also genuinely does care about Rick. A lot of people are under the impression that Season 1 Shane and Season 2 Shane are completely different people, which is true for the most part, but it's not like his character just changes overnight. Well, it is, but it's not like there's not a reason for his change. When he kills Otis to get the supplies back to Carl, his whole mindset changes. I don't think Shane was mentally prepared for the toll this would actually take on him. He talks to Andrea about this, saying that sometimes you have to live with the choices you make and move on from them or else you're gonna die. I think a lot of Shane's characteristics and choices this season stem from how uncomfortable he is about how things went down with Otis. It affects all aspects of his life. It further drives him against Rick, furthers his feelings for Lori, and causes the whole outburst at the barn. He knew this group needed a villain, and he was okay with being that villain because he himself felt like the villain. Maybe you think I'm giving Shane too much credit, that he was just insane from the start and the whole Otis situation popped the lid off of that, but if you go back and watch those episodes right after Otis's death, Shane is a changed person, a much darker and lonelier person than he was before, and a few episodes later he becomes villain Shane because he just doesn't know how to process his own decisions. With all that being said, when we get to the episode Pretty Much Dead Already, Shane is 100% correct about everything. The way he goes about it, not so much, but if he hadn't had this outburst and forced everyone to kill the walkers, they would have been dead very quickly. Because Rick wasn't changing a damn thing. Rick, while he had differing opinions than Herschel on the walkers still being people, he was gonna go along with Herschel, bringing more walkers into the barn until eventually this would be the death of all of them. All it takes is one mistake, one mishap, and the barn full of walkers would have escaped and killed everybody if they weren't ready for it. And Rick absolutely 100% would have let this happen. Rick in this season is far too busy trying to please both sides. He wants to be the good guy, the glue that holds everybody together, but Shane realizes that that's not gonna work. When he tells Lori that Rick ain't built for this world, he's not wrong. This version of Rick Grimes would have definitely gotten the whole group killed eventually. But when Shane opens the barn, demonstrates how walkers aren't people anymore, it changes the dynamic of the group entirely. The episode Nebraska showcases this perfectly. The group gets split on what Shane did. Some people like Andrea and T-Dog admire him and thank him for what he did because it was for the better, while others are appalled and think that it was the wrong thing of him to do. Regardless of whether Shane was or wasn't right, he starts causing rifts in the group, and once that starts, it takes somebody who's willing to make the hard choices to bring everybody back together. Enter Rick "We don't kill the living" Grimes, making those hard decisions at the bar later that day. The bar scene is absolutely fantastic, mostly because of how subtle everything is. When they run into these guys, it's not painted on their foreheads that they're bad guys like most of the people they run into later are, but there's a few things that they say about how they haven't had a girl in a while, about how they've had to do horrible things just to get by, that gives Rick the indication that something's off, and he makes a decision that if he had made it literally 1 second later, he'd be dead. This is the moment that Rick stops trying to be the good guy. This is the moment that he stops trying to be everybody's friend, because after this, he has no problem sticking up to Shane, making those decisions that are for the best and keeping everybody else alive. In a lot of ways, Rick's killing and Shane's killing of Otis mirror each other. They both change our characters and prove that it's actually Rick who's built for this world, not Shane. Also, side note, when they get attacked at the bar, Herschel ends up killing one of the dudes in their party. Imagine surviving in an apocalypse for a good amount of time just to end up getting taken out by an 80-year-old drunk guy. Don't know why, but that made me laugh. Now I feel like it's time to talk about the elephant in the room. Lori. A lot has been said about Lori over the years, and just about all of it is fully warranted, but also a lot of the stuff with Lori comes from a place of hatred or thinking that the character wasn't all that great, and with that, I disagree. Two things can be true at the same time. Lori can be a terrible mother, a terrible spouse, manipulative and frustrating to watch, while also still being a great character. Watching this again, I think that Lori is trying her best to keep everybody happy and be helpful to those around her. She just goes about it in the worst possible way. In a lot of ways, she reminds me of Catelyn Stark, who does the exact same thing, trying to make the best decisions, but actually ends up making the worst decisions. Lori is a character that actually isn't built for this world. She can't make those tough decisions once she's already in a situation that she got herself into. I truly don't blame Lori for getting with Shane when she thought Rick was dead. I don't. Was it a little early in the apocalypse to totally forget your husband? Yes, it was. But we also don't have any point of reference to judge her on because the apocalypse is the apocalypse. You think you're gonna die like every second of every day, and Shane was there for them. He took care of them, so it's probably just mentally easier to divert your feelings of grief from your dead husband by clinging onto somebody else, especially somebody that not only reminds you of your husband, but is going out of his way to keep you safe. That all makes sense, and I don't blame Lori for that at all. But what I do blame Lori for is trying to please everybody in the second season. Her and Rick are both guilty of this, but Shane says he wants to leave because he can't have Lori and there's no place for him anymore. But she tells him to stay, giving Shane some sort of hope that there might be a future there. Rick kills those guys in Nebraska because they posed a threat, and Lori tells Rick that Shane poses a similar threat, so what's he gonna do to protect his family? Lori thanks Shane for saving her and Carl and says that what they had together wasn't one-sided. Rick kills Shane, fulfilling a request that Lori basically made, and she can't even look at Rick after that. In one of my earlier videos, I forget which one, I said that Lori gets a bad rap and doesn't play Rick and Shane against each other, but after watching this season in its entirety again, that's exactly what she does. But I also don't think it's intentional. I think, similarly to Shane, Lori doesn't know how to deal with the consequences of her actions. I think that she was hoping that everything would kind of just go away and all the drama would be dealt with if she kept on playing nice to everybody involved, but that's not how the world works, especially this world. And on top of inciting more rage between Rick and Shane, she can't keep her eyes on Carl if her life depended on her. Lori getting mad at Rick for killing Shane is hugely hypocritical, but the scene also makes it seem like maybe she's mad at him because Carl is the one who actually had to put him down, when she was the one who was supposed to be watching him. She really just never has any leverage in her arguments, and that's across the whole season. I ultimately think Lori was a very necessary character, but it felt like the writers kept on flip-flopping on what they wanted her to do and who they wanted her to be, so she ended up being this hypocritical and aggravating character. The second half of the season and the whole Randall situation is written and executed to perfection. It reminds me of the same storyline from Breaking Bad when they have to decide what to do with the guy who survived and their moral dilemma in the whole situation. It's a storyline that only really works in the beginning of the apocalypse because our characters are struggling to preserve the old world and their old moral compass, but also realize that tough decisions need to be made in order to survive in this new world. 18 Miles Out is the culmination of events set up from the very first episode. Things finally come to a head between Rick and Shane. They fight over what to do with Randall after he says that he knows who Maggie is. Shane thinks that they should just kill him, but Rick says they need to go over a new plan, so they start fighting, but the real reason why they're fighting is a bit more obvious. You know, Shane dirtied their new 2011 Hyundai Tucson. But while this is a good episode, it's also incredibly strangely paced with two very different conflicting storylines. But Rick eventually gets his way and they bring Randall back to the farm. The conversation about keeping Randall alive really encapsulates the whole season. The debate about morality in this world and how it's changed in the opinion of the majority, how people who are stuck living in the old world aren't gonna last here in this new one. These are all themes that represent this season, and having it all culminate in this moment, this one conversation about a man's life they're so willing to take and the one person who's against it, shows how different the group is now and the path that they're going down. It's also one of the most beautifully acted scenes by Jeffrey DeMunn, and heartbreaking because of what happens a few minutes later. Dale died knowing that the world he knew was gone. Shane's death comes at the proper moment and obviously signifies a great change in Rick. I remember there being talks of a deleted scene or something along those lines of like how Shane's gun wasn't actually loaded and he wanted Rick to kill him, which would have been cool, but I ultimately don't think that was Shane's true intentions. He definitely was there to kill Rick. Having him come back alive and Carl being the one to finally end it was also a great scene, one that, again, had Lori lose sight of her son despite all of them being confined to the house. The Walker herd attacking the farm shows all of them how brutal the world truly is. How they were really just biding their time staying at the farm in this wide open area with no true fortifications. And then we see just how far Rick progressed this season when he says that they are not a democracy anymore, they are in a Ricktatorship. He's done playing both sides and making everybody happy. It's his way or the highway, and they can either get on board or leave. This is at times great for the group, and other times not so much. But we'll get to see more of that in Season 3. I'm gonna give Season 2 of The Walking Dead a solid 8.7 out of 10. There's a lot to love about Season 3, but there's also a lot of questionable things about Season 3. I always thought back on this season really fondly. Watching it again, I still have a lot of really good things to say about it, but it's also not exactly the season I remember for a variety of reasons. So I'll be going over different plot points, character arcs, all sorts of things, but let's start off with the first episode and the very first scene. The opening sequence shows us just how much time has passed since we last saw the group. There's obviously the look of them. Lori is far more pregnant than she was before, everybody's really dirty and grimy, and Herschel looks far different. They even go to show him last because we're supposed to be like, whoa, no, Herschel really let himself go. But what I love about this scene is that there's no dialogue. They're clearing this house as a unit. They have this trust in each other that wasn't there before, and they have a clear formula for doing these things now. The group is also far more competent now. Even Carl is clearing rooms and making shots that Rick couldn't do in the first season. Gone are the days where Rick runs away from two walkers. Really, anybody in this group can take down anything that comes their way. They find the prison and come up with a plan to clear the walkers instead of just saying, well, it's overrun, better look elsewhere. And they also take the prison in just a few minutes. If this was a later season, they'd find the prison, take an episode to discuss if they want to take it or not. If they can take it, something would happen to prevent them from doing it, and after 5 or 6 episodes, there'd be a cliffhanger on whether or not they actually did take it. But nope, this was season 3, and everything in this 16-episode season is paced beautifully. Rick is immediately a more hardened man. He really can't stand Lori, he doesn't take shit from the prisoners, and killing Tomas because he stands in opposition against him really puts that in perspective. This really isn't the same Rick as the first 2 seasons. This is also the season that Rick really starts to become a great character and leader, at least in some episodes. I also think this is when Andrew Lincoln really sets into the role and understands the character. Not that he didn't before, because he always did, but it seems really like he's more comfortable and able to play up smaller scenes and put his own spin on the character. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but I feel like the first 2 seasons he was more confined between 2 lines, and now he feels comfortable playing outside those lines, if that makes any sense. Same goes with Carol, who seems to have adapted since we last saw her, learning some of Herschel's tricks about healing and also seeing life the way it is now. She's more confident in herself and her skills and sticks up for herself. She also gets colder and darker as the season goes on, telling Andrea to sleep with the governor so that way she can kill him, and even sticking up to Merle and confronting him about what side he's really on. This is a far cry from the Carol we knew at the beginning of the series, and even at the beginning of the season when the writers were contemplating killing her off. One of the primary characters introduced in this season is, of course, Michonne. Across the first half of the season, Michonne has very few lines. In episode 6, she's one of the featured storylines, but doesn't say a single word. But we also identify with her and support her character because she's the only one who thinks something is wrong with the governor and Woodbury. So the show was really making us support Michonne and go against Andrea. It's easy for an audience to watch a show with all the information and root for Michonne to unravel everything. It's kind of like character 101, but it's also much easier to look at a character making the wrong decisions and root against them, which this season does at every turn they can with Andrea. I have a lot of thoughts on Andrea. I'll get to more of them later, but as it stands, I think Andrea gets a really bad rap. Not because the decisions that she makes are polarizing, she makes every single bad decision possible in this season, but because I think the writers did her so dirty. She was a sacrifice in this show for more drama, but they knew the audience wouldn't side with her or even root for her or even respect her, and I honestly feel really bad for Laurie Holden, but more on that in a bit. Laurie's death episode is great. I have an episode analysis on it, I'll link to it right now, but this episode is literally just a bad day that keeps getting worse and worse, and it obviously changes the trajectory of the show. Daryl steps up when Rick is going insane from Laurie's death. He immediately recognizes that Rick is losing it, goes out on a run to get baby formula, which I feel like they should have had a long time ago, but whatever, and even steps outside his own comfort zone to become a leader for the group. It's stuff like this that made Daryl become the character that he eventually became and a great replacement as protagonist of the show. One thing I need to bring up in regards not only to this season but the entire show is the makeup and practical effects. This season, they got a noticeably bigger budget, and still a lot of that went to the effects. While there's tons of zombie media out there, none of them look nearly as good as The Walking Dead's zombies. That goes from season 1 to the end of the show to all the spin-offs. Everything about the makeup, the practical effects in this show, in its entirety is an A+. Insane Rick is probably my least favorite Rick in the show. He's just a selfish asshole. Might be a comparison that only a few of you guys understand, but it kind of reminds me of the Order of the Phoenix book, because Harry is an insufferable asshole for like half of that 800-page book, and it's this character that you really like and connect with, but can't really connect with at the moment. And that's how I feel about Rick in the beginning of this season. Rewatching the show in its entirety has been such a treat because it reminds me of episodes like the mid-season finale, an episode I've probably only seen 1 or 2 times, and it's absolutely excellent. I'm actually surprised I don't have an episode analysis on it yet, but it's going to be one that I do here very shortly. There's so many different layers to the storylines, and the human encounters used to carry so much weight behind what's going on. This was built up from the 3rd episode of the show when the governor was introduced, and the stakes feel so high because of its proper build-up. There's a lot of highlights in this episode, but one of them is the suspense built up between Daryl and Merle fighting on opposite sides. Daryl has the most interesting story this season that he ever gets the whole show. When Daryl leaves with Merle, there's a noticeable emptiness in the prison. The struggle between wanting to help your brother or your family is very interesting, and it takes a toll on every single person at the prison. The second half of season 3 is nowhere near as good as the first half. A lot of it just feels underwhelming because it's supposed to be Rick versus the governor and all the drama surrounding that, but it just doesn't live up to the expectations set up from the first half. There's some great moments and resolutions like Glenn and Maggie getting engaged and Merle's redemption, and even the episode where Rick and the governor meet and the conversations that play out between them and everyone outside is really excellent writing, but a lot of that tension and suspense is lost along the process. I think the best episode in the second half of the season is Clear, which is strange because this is, on all accounts, a bottle episode. But seeing Morgan again after so long and all the dialogue between him and Rick is so interesting. We also got to see Carl bond with Michonne, which is huge for their friendship. This is also kind of like the first family outing, so for a bottle episode, this ends up being pretty important in the context of the future of the show. Rick's speech in the penultimate episode about how this has to be a democracy shows how different he is from the governor and proves thematically how important the threat he posed actually was. It was the perfect time in the show to introduce a human villain because the world had grown, these characters had grown, and it further reinstates that this show is a drama about characters surviving in the apocalypse, not just a zombie survival show. Rick's internal struggle about trading Michonne over to the governor is another really great bit of writing. Michonne has done nothing but help the group since she arrived, but she also doesn't really mean much anything emotionally to anybody, at least not as much as the other people in the prison. On paper, it makes a lot of sense for Rick to trade her, but he can't do that. That's his humanity right there, and it's another thing that separates him from the governor. So Merle takes it upon himself to do it, but even he has a shred of humanity left, and pays for it with his life in what is Daryl's most emotional scene in the entire show. The finale itself is very underwhelming, but also indicative of how the second half of the season went overall. I'd say it's probably my least favorite finale across all seasons. Andrea's whole storyline is just badly executed, and it truly feels like they wrote it to have the audience root against her. She wants to play both sides and expects everybody at the prison to welcome her back with open arms, and after everything she learns about the governor, she still doesn't try to do anything up until it's too late. I felt nothing at her death, and sure, Laurie Holden had a contract up to season 7, but the writers did her so dirty this season that winning the audience's favor back would be too tall a mountain to climb. Andrea takes her sweet ass time getting the pliers off the ground, having such a difficult time doing it too, and then just kind of sits around when Milton is dying and has absolutely no agency whatsoever. It's infuriating writing, and it's when the audience wants to see your character die. Her death doesn't even make narrative sense. She didn't contribute anything to the war, have them form a truce, absolutely nothing. I think the writer saw an opportunity to kill off a fan least favorite and went for it. Laurie Holden has even spoken out about the writing for her character. She said that it's not the direction that she was told that they were going in, and it's not the direction that she wanted to go in, so overall I just feel very bad for her. There is an interesting moment in the finale. Michonne asks Rick about why he saved her, if it was just for the baby formula, and he says, "Nah, it must have been something else." Is that some kind of romantic spark between them? I don't know, I'm probably just going crazy. Them together would be a long shot. It probably wouldn't happen for like at least another 3 seasons. So those are my thoughts on season 3. This is actually a bit shorter than I expected, but I've said everything I need to say, I think. I still think this is a really good season, but it's far from the series' best. The first half of the season is like a straight A+, but the second half I'd say is like a B- or C+. So to round all that out, input the equation, carry the 2, I'd say it's like an 8.5 out of 10. Now we get to see what life is like at the prison with the governor gone. Sorta. As much as I liked season 3, it did have a very underwhelming finale and just an underwhelming second half in general, so having this time jump at the beginning of season 4 feels like a nice reset and cuts ahead of the boring parts that we don't really care to see. The first episode is titled 30 Days Without an Accident, and this show's story is practically based on accidents and incidents, so I feel this time jump is necessary for a number of reasons. We see how different characters are from the last time we saw them, how much the prison has changed and grown, and just from an audience perspective, it feels like time has gone on in this world as it's gone on in our own lives. One thing I'm noticing a lot on this rewatch that for some reason I didn't realize the first time I watched it, yes, even with watching every episode twice a week, is how much setup there is for Rick and Michonne. I'm not sure why, but I remember by the time they do get together, oh, spoiler I guess, I never saw it coming. But even all the way back in season 4, there's plenty of setup. I also love how Michonne tells him that he needs to shave because he's losing the war as a joke, but in the trailer that line was super serious.
Your face is losing the war. You're losing the war.
The first episode really is a happy beginning. Life seems pretty great, so of course they drop us into the story when shit starts to go bad. Herschel gives Rick a speech about being too far gone, that he came back and we all get to come back. All stuff I've heard a number of times before, but in a different episode. I just never realized that these exact lines were said to Rick back in the first episode. With this small time jump, we get several character changes, but the most noticeable is Farmer Rick. But before I get into him, let's go over everybody else. Beth is incredibly cynical. Her new boyfriend dies, and she quite literally doesn't even shed a tear. She's so used to people dying and having to grieve that she doesn't allow herself to open up to anybody anymore. Michonne, on the other hand, is incredibly open with these people now, specifically Carl and Rick for some reason. She's honestly a very different character from the person she was in season 3, not in a bad or jarring way, but she's just more comfortable now and the more fun and witty side of her comes out. Carl is more mature now. Sure, he's still a naive kid, but he almost has a more realistic outlook than even Rick does across the first few episodes. He's ready to pull his end of the weight in this group, and he's actually capable enough physically and mentally to do that now. Carol has adapted to the world. After almost dying several times now, she's prepared to make the hard choices that nobody else wants to. Daryl has accepted a leadership role. Reluctantly, but still accepted it. He realizes that people around the prison look up to him and feel safe with him on their side. Same goes for Glenn and Maggie. They're pillars of this community now and make sure to let everybody know that they're there for them, but also make sure that their relationship is stable because frankly, their relationship is another beacon of hope for everybody around. And then there's Farmer Rick. Farmer Rick makes sense given Carl's dark turn at the end of the last season, but I feel like he almost takes it too far, not even being able to kill walkers until a few episodes into the season. Rick has his own new hero's journey in this season. He's Farmer Rick at first, but then realizes that this place is kind of falling apart without him in a leadership role. So he takes it back on. This does make his storyline a little boring in these opening episodes. Yes, it is necessary for him to kind of come out of his shell again and realize he's still needed by this group of people, but that doesn't stop me from thinking that he's still a little boring in these first couple episodes. But in this lawless world, when a crime is committed, especially amongst a strong community, the law is needed, so Rick dons the detective hat and magnifying glass to try and figure out who killed Karen and David. Of course, he eventually finds out who killed them, and goes on to make a decision that only a strong leader can make. The whole sickness plotline feels ahead of its time in a way, and I actually think it's a pretty underrated storyline. It's one of the more grounded aspects of living in the apocalypse and still makes for great drama and character development. I think a lot of the disappointment from this story comes from the misdirection from the trailer. I made a whole video about Walking Dead trailers and their use of misdirection if you want to check that out, but this whole plotline wasn't even hinted at in the trailer. In fact, it was the exact opposite of hinted at. It was hidden. For people that don't like the story, that just binged it and never watched the trailer, well, I don't know, maybe it's just a bad storyline, but I liked it. At the end of the day, it is just a reason to kill off all the red shirt characters in preparation for the second half of the season, but it adds some more layers to this world and creates a good amount of tension between the characters. It was also the perfect storyline to send off Herschel to. Herschel's speech about risking your life is one of the best speeches in the show. It's up there with the best Rick ones, Shane's barn speech, and it really speaks to who Herschel is. Yes, he's old, he's very susceptible to getting this disease, but he has the knowledge needed to help out, and he'd rather risk himself going into the sick cell block than his daughters or anybody else he cares about. Herschel doesn't care if this leads to the end for him. In fact, by the end of it, I almost think he wished it was the end for him. He's not able to help or save everybody that he wanted to. He realizes that in this world, his best efforts aren't able to save everyone, and everybody around him that he cares about in this world has somebody else that they care about. Herschel is, in a lot of ways, very much alone. Anyways, somebody have better told Judith about Beth, because that girl literally exclusively has scenes only if she's holding the baby. It was like that in season 3 as well, so Daryl, you better be reading some bedtime stories about the girl that carried her for the first, I don't know, should be like years, but at least the first several months of her life. The first half of the season introduces us to the kids of the prison, specifically Lizzie and Mika. All of the Carol and Lizzie stuff in the beginning of the season really breaks my heart. Carol cares about this young girl and wants to teach her how to survive, but I think what she's teaching her ultimately harms her in the end. I think this is where the writing for Carol differentiates from characters like Lori and Andrea. They had a clear goal in mind with Carol, and although what she's doing is incredibly flawed and ultimately works against her, we can see her reasoning for doing all of this. With Lori and Andrea, we didn't really understand their thoughts because they, quite frankly, didn't make a ton of sense. But Carol wants these kids to be able to take care of themselves, and nobody else is willing to teach them, so she takes that on for herself. While she has the right intentions, it doesn't necessarily make her choices correct in the end. When Daryl, Bob, Michonne, and Tyrese go out on a run, Bob literally almost pulls a gun on Daryl for a bottle of alcohol, and this leads to one of my absolute favorite Daryl moments because Norman plays this scene so well. He's angry and he has every right to be, and he's literally holding himself back from strangling this man. And that's what I mean by Daryl has stepped up to become a leader. I think the Daryl of the first 3 seasons would have killed Bob right here, no hesitation. They're also in a car and they get some sort of signal on the radio. A place that says it's a sanctuary for all, but it kind of cuts in and out. Wonder if that'll ever come back into play. I mentioned it already, but Internment is a great episode and a great send-off to Herschel. Even though there's an additional 2 episodes after this, they're both centered on the governor, and we don't even see our group, so Internment is really Herschel's send-off episode. The Walking Dead always does this, highlights a character in an episode that they're either getting killed off in, or the episode right before they're getting killed off in, but this was pretty hidden among some other really obvious character deaths that would come in the later seasons, so it made Herschel's actual death 2 episodes later still very shocking. The governor-centric episodes are great in their own right. I really don't think it needed to be 2 episodes. I think it starts to drag a bit in the second episode, but it's really satisfying to see the governor lose himself and everything around him, and scary to see just how easily he can build it back up again and what he's willing to do in order to get power. One thing these episodes do highlight is how great of an actor David Morrissey is. He was great in season 3, I don't think I mentioned that before, but seeing him lead 2 episodes on his own really gives him the proper time to shine. In the first episode, we think that maybe the governor has turned over a new leaf, and maybe we're going to see some sort of redemption arc. Martinez gives him the benefit of the doubt, and we start to truly believe that the governor is a changed man. But he's not. He's a deranged sociopath, and some things don't ever change. Martinez not outing the governor immediately is honestly up there with some of the stupidest decisions in the entire show. Maybe I understand the benefit of the doubt, maybe, but when he doesn't fit in with anybody around camp and starts looking angry all the time, some red flags have got to be thrown out there, like, come on now, Martinez. In the end, Martinez's trust is betrayed, and it leads to his own death. But if Martinez had been smart and outed the governor right away, we wouldn't have gotten Too Far Gone. Too Far Gone is obviously one of the greatest episodes in the entire show. It really makes up for the lackluster season 3 finale because up until this point, we really hadn't seen an episode like this in The Walking Dead. Having the governor launch a full-on attack that ultimately ends the prison era was not something I expected when this episode first aired. In some ways, you really do think that Rick is going to convince them to live together, and in some alternate universe out there, that is the plotline that happened, and honestly, that's a really great what-if scenario. But the governor's thirst for revenge comes above the wants of his new people. He ultimately goes to this prison to destroy it, along with everybody who took the precious life he had away from him. He doesn't care about these people, but he certainly acts like he does, and that's the important part. He knew he was losing the moral battle even with his own people. They were starting to side with Rick, so he had to do something drastic to change people's opinions on the matter. He was reminded of the bloody stump out in the woods that said liar, and then makes a decision that proves he was actually too far gone. Herschel's death is surprising, shocking, gut-wrenching, and the show had never had a death like it. Maybe Dale before this, but deaths like Andrea and Lori or even T-Dog never hit as hard as Herschel's death did. It worked super well here, but also led to some not so great shocking deaths down the line. The multiple different point of views at the prison battle are all really great, either ending storylines or setting up new ones. Mostly setting up new ones for our group of characters, but this truly was the perfect, tragic end to the prison era and proved, once again, that this is the zombie apocalypse. It's not your typical family drama. The episode after Too Far Gone, titled After, really felt like a glimpse into the future of the show for a lot of reasons. For one, it only features Rick, Carl, and Michonne, another hint towards this future family. Carl is also very heavily featured over an injured and seemingly dying Rick, kinda hinting at what the show would be like once Rick dies and Carl takes over as the lead, cause surely that's what's gonna happen, right? But this is also an episode where it felt like the writers had a solid direction for Carl. They knew what they were doing with him here and how to write him. It's by far the best episode for Carl in the entire series. I also completely forgot that Michonne had a son. Her backstory is told in a really cool way that's unique to all other backstories that we see in the show. One thing I have to mention is the music, specifically the change of music. Starting this season, the music changed drastically to what we had heard in previous seasons. It became less Western and more synth and ominous piano, and I really like it. While the Western-sounding music worked for the first couple seasons, it does start to feel a little out of place in this season, so I'm glad that they changed it. Some people might not feel the same way, but seasons 4 to 6 had the best music in the show, and they were also the best seasons of the show.
Coincidence? I think not!
One thing I thought of specifically during these second half episodes was why they didn't have a plan, or at least a meeting place to go to if they all got separated. When the prison fell, there's really no excuse for them not to have a meeting place for this exact scenario. The same exact situation happened back in season 2, and they didn't learn from that? The splitting of the groups and the subsequent drama it invites is some of the best writing in the show. The second half of season 4 might be my favorite stretch of episodes across the entire series. Tyrese escaping with Lizzie, Mika, and Judith and running into Carol is incredible for the drama the situation invites. But honestly, I felt really bad for Tyrese on the road with these 2 little girls and a baby. Not to mention one of them is a rabbit-killing psychopath. When he sees Carol, he's so relieved to have somebody else to rely on now, and Carol's kind of taken back because she doesn't really know what he knows. It's a great scene and sets up a great episode down the road. The episode Inmates is such a great paced episode showing multiple different storylines in one episode. Why they ever went away from doing this, I have no idea, because this episode was fantastic. Seeing the different point of views and landmarks that all the characters pass at one point or another but barely miss each other is amazing, and I just love that kind of shit. I also love how cheesy the intro to Abraham, Rosita, and Eugene is. It leads you to think that they might be villains, but when you understand the character of Abraham later on, this intro is hilarious. Glenn saving Tara proves again that he is a man too good for this world, but it ends up doing him great favors in the long run. The way that Glenn finds out about Herschel's death is heartbreaking, and in general, everything that happens in his storyline makes it seem like he's never gonna see Maggie again. But this also shows us the strength of Glenn. His determination to find her again, no matter how injured he may be, is one of the many qualities that makes us love Glenn and identify with who he is. Another thing I love about the storyline is Eugene. While he tells the group that he has to get to DC to develop a cure, there's all these hints and clues that make Eugene seem like he's not really in a rush to get there. I wonder why that is. The whole branching storylines and seeing hints and clues of where the others were in different storylines and episodes, and this mystery built up over this Terminus place, there's just something about it that speaks to me, and it's honestly when the show really started gripping me for the first time I ever watched it. The build up to Terminus and how each group gets together, their individual storylines, the Claimers meeting Abraham and introducing that whole storyline, even the Daryl and Beth stuff isn't horrible like everybody makes it out to be. The episodes with multiple point of views honestly remind me of the early Game of Thrones episodes. It progresses the storylines and each scene was meaningful without having any fat. There's a rule in writing called get in late, get out early, which essentially means to cut out any fat from the scenes. For example, Rick wakes up when the Claimers are in the house and leaves when he sees an opening. We don't need to see Rick fall asleep, see the Claimers find the house, go inside, and then have Rick wake up. We get what's going on without having all that setup. When we leave the scene, we see that Rick has an opening to escape and stop Michonne and Carl from getting closer, so he takes it. We don't see him explain how he got his murder jacket or what happened inside. We don't need to. That's obviously what he's going to tell them, but since we just saw it happen, we don't need to hear about it again. And that's how all of these plot lines are structured. See what we have to, and then cut away when we're done. The later seasons started to lose this rule, which is why a lot of people think they're boring. They also go from showing us multiple storylines to one, which is another issue a lot of people have with the episodes still. The switch from having multiple different storylines to just one doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. While I don't hate the Daryl and Beth episode, a lot of it could have been cut and still kept all of the emotional beats that really make the episode while progressing the other storylines. We haven't seen what Maggie, Sasha, and Bob are up to for quite a while. That could have been included here, along with Carol, Tyrese, and the girls. We don't need to see every single storyline. Episode 10 doesn't have Rick, Michonne, or Carl, but I bet a lot of people didn't even realize that because of the progression of other storylines and how well paced that episode was. This episode just doesn't feel entirely necessary to have one storyline. If you're gonna do that, you better have a damn good reason why. Episode 9 only has Michonne, Rick, and Carl, partly to put the spotlight on Michonne and Carl, but also to keep some suspense about the other people and if they're alive. There's another episode that does only one point of view, but it's given a really great reason for it to only be one storyline. But the other side of this argument for this episode is that Daryl and Beth think that everybody else is dead. They think it's just them, so we're right along there with them. It's just us, Daryl, and Beth. It's also much cheaper for an episode to only have one storyline and not pay the other actors and get the other locations, etc., and that's the real reason for why there's only one storyline. But the conversations between Daryl and Beth in this episode are all really great and progress both of these characters a lot. The ending is also really fun, brings the themes of the episode together really well. And overall, this episode shows us that Daryl can't remotely handle his alcohol. There's a lot that's been said of Daryl and Beth's relationship. Some people think that it's a brother-sister type of friendship. Other people think that they were setting up an actual romantic partnership. And this was also the time when people thought Daryl might be gay. I think there's good evidence enough for actually all of these theories, but to me it really does seem like they were setting up a romantic relationship. I think it's why they dedicated a whole episode to them, and I honestly think that was the plan. It's obviously not how it ended up, so it seems much more like a brother-sister relationship now, and that's fine because it's also believable in that regard. But I don't know, I really feel like it was intended to be something else. He literally sets up a date and carries her through the door, like come on now. The other episode that only features one storyline is episode 14, The Grove. What I love about The Grove so much, and this whole plot line around Carol and the girls, is we want to root for Carol and what she's saying to these kids to ready them for the world ahead, but we also get to see some insight into Lizzie and her mental state. So we're seeing Carol kind of feed this do or die mindset to Lizzie, and it's obviously not helping her, but Carol can't see that because she thinks Lizzie is just getting stronger, and eventually she'll grow out of the whole walkers are still people idea. The Grove is like a film of itself. This could be the plot of an apocalypse movie without all the background layers, and it would still all mostly make sense. But when you have episodes like this in a TV show, an episode that warrants the single storyline because of how it's structured like a movie, you can tell this story in just 45 minutes because it has all these background layers from episodes previous. This is the darkest episode of The Walking Dead, not only because of its subject matter, but because of how well the story had been set up right from the very first episode of the season. It has huge and devastating payoffs, and above all else, shows a darker side of this world that we already knew was very dark. The penultimate episode of the season reunites Glenn and Maggie's groups together, and they march towards Terminus, some magical safe haven that seems strangely empty, but she says we'll make you a plate of food, so that's good. Wait a minute, what does she mean by that? Another thing I have to point out is the dynamic between Michonne and Carl. It's so great, and even though she starts off just being like a friend towards him, Michonne is a far better mother figure than Lori ever was, and I think Carl realizes that. This, among other reasons, is why the finale A is my personal favorite finale of all time. The switch and contrast between Farmer Rick in the past and the present Rick is amazing. It has my favorite Rick Grimes moment ever, and I love how the episode starts off with Rick teaching Carl how to trap things, just to get caught in a trap at the end of the episode. That being said, screwing with the wrong people is such an incredibly lame line to end the season on. Yes, I understand there's a different version, and the television rules at the time didn't allow any swearing, but if they could have somehow convinced AMC just this once to add it in there, it would have been so much sweeter. And those are my thoughts on Season 4 of The Walking Dead. Future Thrifty here, I just realized I forgot to rate this season. This, like I said, has the best second half of any season in the show, in my opinion. The first half of the season is still good, and it also has one of the best episodes in the entire series. Throw in some of my personal favorite moments in the show, and my personal biases for this season, and I'm gonna give it a 9.3 out of 10. So the first thing I obviously have to bring up about this season is the trailer, because back in the day, The Walking Dead would always get these special extended Comic-Con trailers, and it really started with Season 4, but this season they didn't want to spoil how giant the first episode was going to be, so they, well...
Join us, and we go to Washington and cure this thing.
Let's just say they didn't tell the audience the truth about what was going to happen this season. I made a whole video about this trailer and a couple from the other seasons, but this trailer really went out of its way so that way it wouldn't spoil anything for the premiere, and I think it's worked out in its favor because not only is the premiere one of the 3 highest rated episodes of the show that are all tied for first, but this premiere episode was also the most watched episode in the history of the show. Yes, even above the first episode of Season 7. And it's for good reason that so many people watched this episode and it's rated so highly because this episode is phenomenal. I still think it's crazy just how far they go in the opening minutes. It's a bit jarring when you're binge watching it coming from season 4, when everything about Terminus was kind of teased, but in the first couple minutes they go full on, they don't pull any punches in what is definitely up there with some of the darkest scenes in the entire show. But I think what is so great about this episode is how there hadn't been a premiere of this level before, both in this show and I'd say most other shows out there. When you compare it to the season opener of the season before, there is a clear winner. Most season openers are in charge of setting up the story of the season, whereas this one was in charge of mostly ending the storyline that was set up in the previous season. Kinda a weird choice. I'm sure it won't be a decision they make again in the future in order to kinda replicate the results of this episode. This episode is almost like if Too Far Gone was the premiere of season 4. Sure, they just handled the governor, but what if after a time skip he came back and the opener was just the prison getting destroyed? We have no clue where they're going from there because it's such a wild card of an episode, and especially an episode to open the season on. That's exactly what No Sanctuary is. This episode highlights Carol in a number of ways. We obviously see what she's capable of doing, but there's also a callback to the episode where she was last with the entire group, because this guy is in the lineup at the trough. I think his inclusion in this episode was there to remind Rick of the last time he saw Carol, back when he had things under control and made the decision to leave her behind. So for Carol to save Rick and everybody else, and for him to ask for her forgiveness, just shows how far both of these characters have come since the last time they saw each other. So yeah, it seemed that Terminus was dealt with after a single episode. The trailer straight up lied to us, so where do we go from here? Well, from here, we get the entire group together, and this is, far and away, the greatest version of the group that the show ever gave us. While I have some issues with the upcoming storyline, this group on screen, their dynamics, their conversations, it makes everything worth it. On this watch, I found myself caring about each and every character. Sure, sometimes they don't do much, or the writers come up with some storylines that seem a little bit contrived and like they're just adding in stories for characters to give them something to do, but compared to the groups of the later seasons, each of these characters are just so great to watch. Even the lower tier characters like Rosita, Gabriel, and Eugene end up becoming prominent characters in the future, and it's cool to see their origins, especially for Father Gabriel. But this is also the season that Rick Grimes became the best character in the show. And I know that sounds weird to say with him being the protagonist and all, but season 5 Rick took absolutely zero risks. He didn't care about who you were, if you did any harm to his family, if you were even a threat to his family, he took you out. He's almost kinda similar to another character now. And speaking of Father Gabriel, he gives off all kinds of red flags after everything the group has been through. This is heightened by the white cross on the car that took Beth and him being a priest. I mentioned this before and a lot of people were like, oh yeah, I never made that connection, but that was the first thing I thought of when I saw a priest, and especially the car a few episodes later. He seems to be guilty of something, which he is, but fresh off the heels of Terminus, we think there's something far more sinister up his sleeves. This is part of the reason why Four Walls and a Roof is such an excellent episode. We learn more about Gabriel's backstory and how he really is just a guy that's lucky to survive as long as he has. And then we get the conclusion to the termites, see their full intentions, and see Rick follow through on a promise he made to Gareth. It ends a phenomenally paced first 3 episodes, but this also spelled kind of trouble because the storyline that had been marketed to keep people around was now completely over, which leads me to the Beth portion of the story. I have a lot to say about the Beth storyline, but let's go over the good stuff first. I think there being remnants of a police force trying to maintain their past lives, but also taking advantage of their power is a really great plotline on paper. Beth is an interesting character to be given a full storyline for herself, and I mean that in 2 different ways. She hasn't been given a ton of spotlight in the past, so now seemed as good a time as any to promote her. But that's also interesting because Beth, of all characters, gets put in the spotlight. She gets an entire episode by herself, and when you consider characters like Glenn, Maggie, Michonne, and even Daryl to an extent haven't been given episodes where they're the sole focus, it's just a little bit strange. This felt like the beginning of Beth being given the prominent main character billing in the opening credits, but we all know that's not exactly what happened. So let's go over the bad. Beth wasn't given a bigger role. We spend 3 episodes looking for her, just for her to die when we get to her, making this whole plotline feel like a complete dead end. Did it impact other characters and further their development? Not really. Maggie asked about her sister once, off screen.
She's alive.
And Daryl gave an incredibly sad response to her death, but after Coda and like a few episodes later, Beth is never mentioned again. This whole storyline is just a dead end and signified a bigger problem with The Walking Dead, and that's the need to have shocking deaths. The last mid-season finale ended with a shocking death, so this one must have that too. But the shocking death in Too Far Gone wasn't the point of the episode, it was the loss of the prison. The point of Coda was and is Beth's death, and I guess the group having to go back out on the road again? But why? It would be one thing if Noah became an irreplaceable character of the group who would go on to help them in ways that nobody else could, but that's also not what happens because Noah dies this season too. Outside of a few questionable character arcs like Lori and Andrea, this was the first plotline in the show that truly didn't feel like it was necessary. It was a troubling sign of things to come back when the show truly felt untouchable and had everybody on their heels week after week. I like how the group splits back up after the whole Terminus debacle is dealt with. I like there being multiple different storylines going on at once, but this was also the start of another bad trend, having so many different storylines at once with only one story per episode. Sure, they also did this in the back half of season 4, so I guess it actually started there, but I don't know, I liked those episodes and how it was done, but one thing is true regardless of when it started, this is a story pacing killer. End of the 3rd episode, there's a cliffhanger of Daryl coming back to the church with some mystery character. Next week, we get to see Beth with another cliffhanger. Week after that, we see the group that's going to Washington, and the week after that, we're finally back with Daryl, but it takes the whole episode for us to see the resolution to the cliffhanger that was set up 3 weeks prior. This also meant that 4 weeks would go by without seeing the main character of the show. Now I know a lot of people don't have that issue now because the show is streaming everywhere, but the show did come out week to week, and this momentum killer style of formatting was, in my opinion, what truly led to the show's eventual downfall, and these problems were relevant way back in the golden era of the show, in a season that is a lot of people's favorite. Abraham's backstory is one of the most tragic in the entirety of the show, and doesn't really get brought up enough. He saves his family, but they're so scared of him that they abandon him, and then he finds Eugene, who tells him that he can save the world, so Abraham makes this quest his whole personality so that way he can forget the mistakes and the horror of his past. Mix all this together with a character who has the greatest one-liners and really leans into his corniness, and you have one of the best characters in The Walking Dead. Glenn has always been the level-headed character. He's the only one who can get Rick and Abraham to stop fighting, and he's really there for everybody no matter what. But as for Glenn and Maggie together, in the first half of the season, they're really kind of just there. They obviously have some badass scenes and good moments together, but this was a trend that would somewhat continue. One of them would have a storyline while the other one didn't, and then vice versa, but I don't think either one of them really had a standout storyline during these prime seasons. A lot of their lines come from the unlikely pairing conversations that they have with other group members, or just nice and sweet conversations with each other, but they don't really have anything that makes them stick out. Eugene's lie, and really the buildup of it since the minute he's introduced, is really well done. There's so many different hints and clues to what he's truly trying to do, and it seems really obvious the second time around. I'm not too sure if the first time around I just wasn't as good as picking up on these things, but I didn't realize it. The reveal just absolutely breaks Abraham, and the whole episode is really great. In the episode Consumed, we get to see a lot of Carol flashbacks, some of them from well over a season ago, in locations that The Walking Dead rarely ever revisits, flashbacks or not. This episode also shows us how far the Daryl and Carol friendship has come. They have the reunion in the first episode, their back and forth is incredible, and I also thought that maybe these two could have a romantic moment or two. But ultimately, Daryl doesn't end up with Carol, or Beth, or Connie, or anybody that he's been shipped with, and I think there's something great about a manly man like Daryl, who's ultimately just a soft teddy bear, and is able to have friendships with women without it getting romantic. I like that. Rick and Michonne really are already a team. She talks to Rick like a partner while everybody else talks to him like he's their boss. She's really the only one who can level his head, but she also supports Rick every step of the way. While their dynamic changes over the next couple seasons, the core of their relationship is their friendship and teamwork, and that's something that's very present here and has been present for like a whole season now. So back to Coda. That episode is the most disappointing episode for me of the entire series. It was the first time the show chose shock value over good storytelling. It also doesn't make any narrative sense. They were trying to give Dawn this like redemption arc, saying she wants to change this place, name Beth as her successor, and for all this development, 5 episodes of it, to end it with Dawn killing Beth and even Beth trying to kill Dawn, it doesn't make any sense. Is all of their development for the sake of misdirection? I guess, because otherwise it's just bad writing. It feels like 2 different drafts of scripts with different storylines spliced together. It also ends this half of the season on not only a bummer of a note, but a pretty directionless future. I have an analysis of this episode, but people always like to claim that this is a world where anything can happen. But let me remind you, this show is a drama first. This isn't some ultra-realistic apocalypse. Characters wear skinny jeans, they never have to go to the bathroom, they have perfectly white teeth. It's a drama with a ton of good-looking people. It's okay to prioritize the dramatic storytelling over the survival aspects because this show, hate to break it to you, is a drama first. I always say storytelling is built on coincidence, and people don't really know what I mean by that, so let's go over some examples from this show. Actually, just this season. Morgan finding a paper that has Rick's name on it, coincidence. Carol finding and saving the group at the exact moment that they're gonna be killed, coincidence. Daryl and Carol meeting Noah, who knows Beth, coincidence. The fire truck arriving the second the walkers are going to get out of the church, coincidence. This group arriving at the hospital right as the other group is bringing Beth out, coincidence. This show, every movie, every story is filled with coincidences. The only way I'd revise this statement is if it was like storytelling is built on luck, because a lot of coincidence and luck do overlap, especially in this show, and there are far more circumstances where the characters are lucky. What happens and what's going on is obviously another really controversial episode. It's also a very strange episode for a mid-season premiere. I remember thinking back when this even came out, I was like, the people who binge this series are gonna see Beth's death and then Tyrese's death in back-to-back episodes, and it's gonna be quite a downer, and I was correct. My girlfriend said something about how depressing this season has been after watching this episode. But I think the group arriving at the Shire Wilt Estates is a really cool nod to the comics, and I really felt for Noah here. Imagine being away from your family and friends, just thinking every day about getting back to them, just for the place to be completely destroyed. Also, hot take here, but Tyrese this time around is a much less likable character than I remember. Tyrese's whole character is talking about how he lost Karen and how it impacted him. This would be one thing if we cared about Karen, or even Tyrese and Karen, but we saw their relationship in season 4 for 1 episode, and that was his entire personality afterwards. It doesn't do a great job at making me care for him. Also, he knew Karen for what, like a month? A couple months tops? It doesn't make for a compelling character because I didn't care about the relationship, it wasn't built up enough. Also, if she's so important, why isn't she in this episode? He's seeing a bunch of important dead figures, even the governor for some reason, but not Karen. That being said, I do like Tyrese's death and this episode. I actually wish that we got more main character deaths from walkers. It's by far the most likely death in this world, and even if we got some sort of like copycat episodes like this with cameos from previous people, a very artistic style of filming and pacing, I'd be fine with it because this is a great episode. I suppose Rick's last episode kind of took the template from this episode, but that was more of a special occasion. This is also an important episode to show us just how vital it is for our group to find a home. The episode Them shows us our group at the lowest they've ever been. They have to eat dogs, they walk at a literal snail's pace because they're so devoid of energy, and this episode in particular focuses on 3 characters, that being Maggie, Daryl, and Sasha, aka the people who have lost the most recently. This episode is exhausting. You can feel just how beat down these characters are, and these 3 characters in particular have every reason to give up, but they don't. Rick also has his famous line,
That we are the walking dead.
He said it! He said it!
and we get a nice cliffhanger ending where some random guy comes up to them and says he wants to help. Oh boy. The whole Aaron plotline is excellent. We as an audience have been conditioned to not trust the people in this world, and Aaron comes across as somebody who's too good to be true in this world. So we're right there with Rick and his mindset. Aaron does come across as strangely untrustworthy, which is odd because watching it with a new mindset and knowing who Aaron is, you see things differently, but I'm watching this show with my girlfriend who's never seen it before, and as soon as Aaron popped on screen and knew all about the group, she said that they should just kill him right away. She didn't trust him whatsoever, and it's truly been an amazing experience watching it with her because that was everything I thought the first time too. There are so many red flags raised. He doesn't tell them the whole truth about Alexandria, there's no pictures of the people, and Aaron ultimately seems too friendly. Episode 11 is all about wanting us to feel anxious and afraid of what could happen, because for a whole technical season of the show, almost nothing good has happened to our group. But this all changes when we see Aaron with Eric. For the first time in a long time, our group has hope, and Rick's expression when they arrive says everything. He couldn't hear anything when they were outside of Terminus, but he can hear, and as they enter Alexandria, we enter a whole new era of The Walking Dead, the modern drama era. Entering Alexandria is so jarring in the best possible way. Even just seeing normal people and normal houses feels so outside of The Walking Dead. We center mostly on Rick and Carl and their struggle to cope under these normal conditions in this episode. Rick loses sight of everybody for like 2 seconds, has a full-on panic attack. Carl's hanging out with teenagers and doing normal teenage things, which must be so strange for him because the last time things were normal, he was probably like 8 years old playing with toys. Their struggle to adapt to this new situation is what makes this episode and these next couple episodes so great. I love the interviews and hearing everybody's perspective on this place, how the group stays together at night, and how this episode was basically framed as if Rick or somebody is gonna find some sort of crack in the system, and while there's flaws, there's never that big twist that any of them are expecting. This place is truly as it's advertised, which brings on a whole new set of problems. Now I'm going to talk about Carol again. We know Carol is a complete badass by now, we know everything she's been through, and the storyline the writers came up for her is incredible. Remember, Carol wasn't around at this point in the comics, so they chose to have Carol play dumb and act like she didn't single-handedly take out an entire community and save the whole group. I love this decision for her character, and it eventually makes for one of the best episodes in the series. Now, the amount of characters that they have to show and introduce and develop definitely becomes a balancing act. When they were on the road, it was less of an issue, but the introduction to Alexandria and so many new characters having to be introduced and share the screen time means that a lot of people are shoved to the side. There were many times where I'll just forget about a character until they're on screen again, and then I'm like, wait a minute, where have you been this whole time? Spend is a really great episode, kinda. It raises the stakes and kind of brings us back to reality a little bit because of how well everything was going for the past couple episodes. We get to see just how different our group is from the Alexandrians now that the dust has settled, and we see very clearly that the Alexandrians' way of doing things just gets people killed and it won't work. But just like with Beth's death, this episode needed a character to sacrifice, so let's start giving somebody a character arc, Noah asking Reg about how to build up the walls, and then let's kill them off. This is the same recipe that the show uses again, and again, and again, and again, and all of that started in this season. With the final 2 episodes, I have a really in-depth episode analysis on it, but I love the dynamic that Rick and Carol have and why they're so invested in the problems with the Anderson family. Carol has a past history with abuse, Rick has feelings for Jesse, and I think everything about this confrontation is great. Rick talks about the broken window theory and how if the windows stay intact, then everything is fine, and of course, when the windows are broken, everything collapses. Does it feel like a typical storyline that we'd see out of most other drama shows? Yes, it does, but I think that this show elevates it because of how many different layers there are to this situation and this world. I've also gone in depth about this topic before, but there are a ton of parallels this season between who Rick Grimes is now and who Shane was back in season 2. So if you want to hear a more in-depth explanation on that, check out one of the 2 videos in the top right corner of the video. The season finale is very small scale in comparison to a lot of the other season finales or even mid-season finales, but I think it's very character focused and has a lot of different point of views that mix together very well. It's a great paced episode, the plot lines are built up suspensefully, and it all comes to a head. We also get a very anticipated reunion between Rick and Morgan, and I love all of Morgan's scenes and glimpses throughout the season. This is a great cliffhanger to end the season on. We're given a lot of new questions about how things will play out, but it ends the story it was telling for this season. I hope that all future cliffhangers will be just as good as this one, but I suppose we'll just have to wait and see. So is Season 5 still the golden era of The Walking Dead, or is it not as good as I remember it to be? I've been thinking about that question ever since I was making this video and watching the show again, and I still don't really have a good answer. In some ways, I was really disappointed with this season, and with how some of the storylines played out, but then I think back to the first 3 episodes, everything happening at Alexandria, the Rick and Shane parallels, and how this is some of my favorite Walking Dead of the entire series. But this is also undeniably where the writers started struggling. Things didn't play out to a satisfying degree sometimes. There were questionable character choices and deaths, and the pacing in the first half of the season was what eventually would go on to kill the show. But there's a big difference between this season and the later seasons that have all these issues, and that's the simple fact that I care about these characters. I cared about the stuff they were going through, how the situations around them changed them as people, and I have a lot of nostalgia and love for this era of the series when it was on TV. So overall, I'm gonna give this season of the show a 9 out of 10. But starting off with episode 1, I really didn't like the whole black and white flashbacks aspect. Starting out real strong here, calling this my favorite season, and immediately going into what I don't like. But especially because this isn't real black and white, like they didn't shoot this in black and white film, they just took the scenes and dropped the saturation down to 0 like this. You can tell this is what they did because the trailer has scenes from the season opener that are in color. It just felt a little weird to me that the show didn't think its audience was smart enough to understand the difference between past and present, a little hint towards how this season in particular would treat its audience throughout the whole season. However, the story presented is really solid. We get to see the direct aftermath of Reg's death and how this affects each character, and more of the much anticipated reunion of Morgan and Rick. There are some nice callback moments these two share in their dialogue, but their reunion is a bit underwhelming. This is something I went over more in my episode analysis, which, upon watching this again, I actually think their reunion makes a lot of sense. These are 2 very different men at different stages in their life, and yeah, they knew each other at the beginning, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they owe each other anything in present day, especially in this kind of world. They don't turn into fast friends, Daryl doesn't get replaced as right-hand man, and for the most part, Morgan and Rick are just kind of around each other for most of this season. Does it make sense? Actually, yeah, it does, but it's still a bit disappointing. And because they didn't form any sort of emotional connection with each other, this spelled certain doom for a plotline down the road, but I'll get there, well, when I get there. Now, the actual main plot with the Walkers that carries this entire first half of the season, and an additional episode after that, is one of the reasons why I love this season so much. Everybody always complains about how walkers are never a threat in the later seasons, but here they were still presented as a major threat. In fact, this is the last time that they are treated as a major threat. After this, walkers become obstacles in the road, not something detrimental to their safety in the world. Even when walkers, for some reason, learn to climb and fight back, this is still the last true time that the walkers were seen as these horror monsters. I love the actual start, like the opening scene and the whole plan going sideways from the walkthrough of the plan. It proves that most of these people truly weren't ready for this mission, and now there's additional factors that they have to take care of, and I think this is far more interesting for the story rather than everybody being completely ready and the plan just not working. This way adds way more stakes to the story while still treating our characters with respect and not just making it seem like they had a bad plan. They had a great plan, but with the mix of it being too early and some other outside factors beyond their control, it forces them to improvise. When the opening scene came on, my girlfriend was like, how did we get here? Did we somehow skip an episode? Because it definitely feels that way at first glance with this mini time jump and Morgan just being part of the group now. But then, of course, it goes back into the black and white, so that way we know that it takes place in the past. The second episode, JSS, shows us what happens back at home, and this is one of my favorite episodes in the entire show. While the boomerang style of storytelling in seasons 4, 5, and 6 get on some people's nerves, myself included, I think that this episode and this whole storyline with the horde of walkers actually gives a reason for it. Knowing that the A-team is out there dealing with the walkers and the B-team is at home makes it the perfect time for the wolves to strike. Not that they knew that the majority of the fighting force was elsewhere, or maybe they did, but writing-wise, it's perfect timing. We see how weak the Alexandrians really are, and how some of them have taken on Rick's philosophy, but we also unleash the wolf in sheep's clothing named Carol. Some people don't like how Carol is able to just do all these amazing feats, and while it does get ridiculous as the show goes on, something like this is just because she's smarter than the enemy she's attacking. She puts on the wolf's clothing and blends in to attack them. She's not just going all John Wick on them. This also sets up the dynamic that she has with Morgan that would go on for the next 3 seasons. This episode just has perfect writing, and the circumstances around it are amazing. In episode 3, we cut back to where we left our characters in the first episode. The horn is blowing, our characters are retreating and panicking, trying to figure out what to do next and what's going on. We also continue the trend of seeing the Alexandrians not ready for a mission like this, and our group having to simultaneously try and fix the plan while saving the others. And Rick understands this. He knows that the Alexandrians aren't all gonna make it back, and he even tells that to Michonne and Glenn, who don't really want to agree with them, but as the episode goes on, it proves that he was right. The episode starts off with like an entire group of people until they all split up, and a total of 3 people make it back to Alexandria. They try and fix the plan, but in that attempt, the characters make rash and personal decisions, and it doesn't end up fixing anything. We also get the end to the Glenn and Nicholas storyline, a storyline that I actually really like. This whole plotline shows us who Glenn really is at his core. He sees the good in people, and that sort of mindset can ultimately lead to your own demise in this world. Or maybe not, but this gave Glenn something to do in his time at the beginning of Alexandria, his own plotline away from Maggie, and they also kind of do this with Maggie working with Deanna, but she also gets far less screen time than Glenn did. I have a lot of thoughts on this Glenn fake-out death, but I'll get to that a little bit later. The first 3 episodes of this season are what I believe to be the best 3-episode stretch in the entire show. Each episode just builds more suspense, and the stakes just get higher and higher. I love the dynamics between the characters, the differences between our group and the Alexandrians, and how everything just seems to go wrong no matter what. If this had happened even just a month after Rick took over the place, everybody might have been more ready, everybody would be more in tune with the plan, and all of this might have gone smoother. Even with the wolves attacking, if the Alexandrians were better prepared, I think most, if not everybody, walks out of this mission alive. So I was excited to see this momentum continue and see more of the stakes being raised. But then episode 4 didn't do that. Here's Not Here is a fantastic episode of The Walking Dead. We all wanted answers to the mysteries of Morgan's backstory and how he came to be the way that he is now, and the answers we get are great. Eastman is a fantastic character, but the issue with this episode is where it was placed. This episode is standalone and entirely skippable. I usually do skip it when I'm watching the first half of season 6. Part of me wants to re-edit this first half of the season into one long, like 3 or 4 hour movie, keep the momentum going and not cut away from it, take out Glenn's fake out death, and maybe one day I'll do that. I'm not sure if I could share it without AMC coming for my head, but I feel like that would be a really fun project, and yes, that is my idea of fun. The 5th episode goes back to our primary storyline, but definitely slows things down. I do love Rick's arrival and his speech at the beginning of the episode.
They're gonna be back.
They're gonna be back.
But I can't imagine being somebody at Alexandria and having all these new people arrive and all these crazy, terrible things start happening. Like a week ago, they were living peacefully and had been for like 2 years, and now a ton of their members are dead. They're being forced to fight for their lives when they were seemingly fine until Rick Grimes showed up. In this slowed down episode, we get to see some minor character progress, like the continuation of the feud between Carl and Ron. It's either in this episode or an upcoming one that they fight, and it's truly one of the worst choreographed fights I've ever seen in my life. We catch up with the rest of the Anderson family, and if Jessie is a hairstylist, why does she give her son the Will Byers haircut? Like, what's the point of your mom being a stylist if you're still just gonna rock with this cut? There's a romance brewing between Rosita and Spencer. At the same time, a romance is forming between Abraham and Sasha. So I wonder if these two will have some sort of mutual understanding and breakup. And honestly, I actually think that Rosita and Spencer look like a nice couple, and she could have actually changed him into becoming a better character. But that didn't happen. Abraham and Rosita don't mutually break up, and this was the start of a trend with really all female characters in this show, but Rosita especially, where if a woman doesn't have a storyline, just pair them up in a new relationship. This is something I noticed watching the series this time around, and it happens over and over and over again. And the writer's treatment of Rosita is far and away the worst when it comes to this, but that's a rant for a later video. Everything setting up Rick and Michonne gets shoved way to the sideline in favor of Jessie, which I can see why they did that. I don't think their intention was to have this woman whose husband was just murdered in another love triangle with Rick and Michonne, but their scenes are cut back by so much that it's really noticeable they had to separate them to further explore the Rick and Jessie romance, which might be a hot take here, but I actually really liked them. Maybe it's just because I'm a sucker for this reality TV style romance between them, but I thought that they had good chemistry. I liked the character of Jessie and who she was turning into, and I felt like she was going to be the comic Andrea replacement, which is probably exactly what they wanted us to think for a later bait and switch shocking moment. Episode 6 once again shows us the Scott Gimple boomerang storytelling at its finest, but this episode isn't actually all that bad. In retrospect, we get character development for Sasha and Abraham, we see the Daryl setup with Dwight, Sherry, and the entire Saviors arc, and I don't think that this episode gets enough credit for that. But I remember first watching this episode, I didn't care about any of this. I just wanted to see if Glenn was alive or not, and now that we're going on 3 weeks of this cliffhanger with no answer, I was starting to lose interest entirely. I still thoroughly believe that a lot of these episodes could have been condensed or combined for greater effect, but this episode also kind of brings a character arc full circle for Daryl, him wanting to go out and recruit people, and when he tries to recruit these people, they ultimately end up betraying him. But it does make me wonder what would have happened if Dwight just accepted this help in the first place. The beginning of episode 7, we return to the scene that Glenn died in for some reason. I don't know why they're making us relive this, it was so hard the first time. Oh wait, it was actually Nicholas on top of Glenn, so Glenn's alive? Glenn's alive, everyone! So, what was the point of this? This fake out death actually doesn't do anything for the story other than maybe add some more stakes, but it's not like there weren't already sufficient amount of stakes to begin with. Tons of people have died on this mission. We find out that Maggie is pregnant. I guess it's to make us think about how terrible it would have been for Maggie to have this child without Glenn, and now that he's actually alive, we don't have to worry about that anymore. Wait a minute. Episode 7 is all about trying to keep Alexandria together. Literally, but also all the cracks are starting to form and people are starting to turn on each other, get angry with each other, which is pretty symbolic for where this place is as a whole when the wall falls. Episode 8 is probably the most underwhelming mid-season finale in the entire show. It doesn't have a shocking death for the sake of a shocking death, so I guess that's a win. Deanna's death is quite symbolic because the Alexandria she envisioned died this day right along with her, so it's sort of a captain goes down with its ship ordeal. But a lot of the plot lines were still being set up, so they couldn't get the payoffs needed to happen in this episode. We didn't get the payoffs because we spent so many episodes covering only one storyline, and not in the way that was needed like in JSS. But then we get the first official mention of this new villain guy named Negan. It's a strange name, but this is another reason why this is my favorite season of the show. I think the whole build-up to Negan is excellent. I remember the whole time around this season airing and how much all the comic readers were hyping up Negan and all the different casting rumors for him. I think that the saviors themselves, and as they're presented in the back half, are honestly really menacing. They were such wild cards. You never really knew what they were going to do or say, and this unpredictability actually made them pretty scary in a way that was lost later on. Now on to the episode No Way Out, the episode that should have been the mid-season finale, but they wanted to give people a reason to come back after the break, so it wasn't. This is the last of the 3 episodes that are tied for the highest rated of the series, and the more I watch this episode, the more I start to feel like it's a little overrated. The bulk of this episode is actually having to do with Denise and the wolf, a storyline that I feel is alright, but I don't buy that the wolf was changing into a good person whatsoever. It's the last 20 minutes or so that make this episode as highly rated as it is, and I think all of this is done incredibly well. The Alexandrians coming together to fight is really impressive and symbolic. The fall of the Anderson family is done very well and is very tragic. But I do think this episode is the worst of the highest rated episodes. It's still a great episode, I'm not saying it's bad in any way, but just not as good as the other 2. Also, with this being the last episode that is this highly rated, in some ways it makes the show all downhill from here at this point onwards, which isn't that great considering we're only about halfway done with the show. The next world is a fun episode. There's not a lot of high stakes, and I think it's a good palate cleanser from the previous episode and the whole previous storyline. We also meet Jesus, which sets up a whole new world, and seeing more of the Rick and Daryl dynamic is always welcome. This is, of course, the first episode when Rick and Michonne first kiss and other stuff. And after rewatching this, seeing all the hints and clues leading up to it, I think this is a very earned moment. I remember when I first saw this, I thought it came out of nowhere, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The hints are literally there, like, from their first meeting. From an audience perspective, we saw far less of the Rick and Michonne dynamic this season, but we did see that Rick has come far enough emotionally to be ready to see someone else. In Knots Untie, with the amount of focus on Abraham, it almost seemed like this was the episode he was going to die in. And going back to what I was talking about earlier with The Walking Dead and its treatment of female characters, let's talk about Sasha. Sasha just went through a whole storyline about finding a new purpose in life. She lost her last boyfriend and then her brother and wanted it all to end, but she continued on. So what can they do with her character now? Let's just find her a new love interest with Abraham. Oh, Abraham already has a love interest? Well, let's forget about her, and then eventually we'll just find her a new love interest too. The Walking Dead didn't really know what to do with female characters other than make them love interests. I always talk about how I don't like the character of Rosita very much, and it's mainly because of this. But that's kind of what it boils down to. Maggie and Carol are honestly the only ones with a concrete storyline about something else other than being a love interest. Maggie starts to become the leader of the Hilltop, and that changes everything. Carol does become someone's love interest, but it's not her primary storyline, and the reality of everything she's done in this world just comes crashing down on her, which makes for an interesting storyline, I guess. But even Michonne from this point forward kind of just gets designated to Rick's love interest. Anyways, in this episode we hear more about this Negan guy and his group of people called the Saviors. Rick offers to take them out because they seem like an issue, and our group has never really come across another group of people that they can't deal with, so why not? But they've also never really gone on the offensive before. And this leads me to my absolute favorite episode in the series, Not Tomorrow Yet. I've talked a lot about this episode in the past, and this is an extremely controversial and polarizing episode. A long time ago, I made a video about how this is the episode when our group became the villains, and some people agreed. Some people said it was hard to root for our characters after this episode, and some people say that the ends justify the means, and I absolutely love all the conversation and debates surrounding this episode. But one thing is absolutely certain in this episode: our group does something that they've never done before: attack another group first. And no, those bikers stopping Daryl, Abraham, and Sasha on the road doesn't count, because that was also in self-defense. And this episode changes the course of the entire rest of the show, for better or worse. I find it very interesting how Morgan is against this attack because he thinks that all life is precious and that no one is ever too far gone, so he starts building a cell. Just an interesting decision, not at all something I'm going to bring up later. This whole episode has stakes that feel very real, and like this is building up to something big, and that's because it is. We see that while not everybody wants to go through with this, they understand that it's the best course of action that they have to take, and in a lot of ways they trust Rick and what he thinks is best. So if he thinks that this is the best course of action, they're gonna take it. This episode is brutal, and in some ways pretty hard to watch. Even our characters hesitate before fully going through with this plan, but as a firefight breaks out, it proves that our group was right and they could take these people on with no casualties. Which is a little strange. This whole build up to these saviors and this is what happens just seems a little too easy. The next episode, The Same Boat, shows us a different side of the Saviors, and also the toll that this life and this lifestyle has taken on Carol and Maggie. This is a great episode, shows us again how smart Carol and Maggie are, and overall I don't really have anything bad to say about it. Twice as Far is guilty of giving a character a spotlight just to kill them. That character being Denise. I've mentioned this a lot now, but The Walking Dead became notorious for doing this around this time in the show, but her death is incredibly shocking and all around tragic. It also sets up a rivalry between Daryl and Dwight, and this definitely continues on, but this is also easily the most intense confrontation and the best scene they have, and it seems to carry the most weight behind it. It again makes the Saviors a pretty menacing force because of how many of them there still are. Now, Carol leaving feels kind of strange and forced. She didn't have any issues with killing or this life in general up until a few episodes ago, and it very much feels like this was needed just for our characters to all leave and go search for her. Maybe people feel differently and this feels natural, but this is also why the reason the episode East is so strange, because I just don't buy into this version of Carol. This episode also completely reinforces how disappointing the Rick and Morgan reunion was this season. There was so much build-up throughout season 5, and it was super highly anticipated. They marketed the whole season around these two, and this is maybe the 3rd or 4th scene that they're in together. They're just two very different characters, and they aren't really friends. Take out their history, and Morgan's really just like Rosita or Eugene in terms of how close he is with Rick. But this episode just gives you the feeling that something bad is coming, and with everybody going out on their own personal agendas, it feels a little contrived, but you're also on the edge of your seat because you're just like yelling at your screen, telling everybody to just go home. It's almost worse when you know what comes next and how easily it could have been avoided had Daryl and Carol just stayed at Alexandria. Last Day on Earth is a strange episode. It's super low rated, but the actual episode itself isn't bad at all. This is actually one of the most successful episodes in the series in terms of what they were trying to do. We start the episode with Rick's mindset. Here, there's only a few saviors. There might be a time in the future to do some battle, but they've got this. Oh, actually, there's quite a bit of them now. Maybe we'll just turn around and deal with this later. Wait a minute, how many saviors are there? We definitely can't take this on now. The suspense and dread that builds as the episode goes on is terrifying, and it feels so isolating as it continues on and there just ends up being more and more saviors. We know something bad is gonna happen, but we didn't know how bad it was gonna be. Everything about the entire ending scene is utterly amazing. Well, not everything, but the scene itself, seeing Rick absolutely terrified, is insane to see, and Andrew Lincoln's performance here is incredible. I can remember watching this scene the first time when it aired, knowing that one of these characters that I really cared for was about to die. I remember my heart racing and having like nightmares about this scene afterwards. This is honestly up there with one of the scariest scenes I can think of, which sounds strange because it's not really that scary, but it's how I felt. And then we get the cliffhanger. otherwise known as the moment that The Walking Dead truly died. This cliffhanger encompassed everything that was wrong with the show, the manufactured story beats, disrespecting the audience's emotions and intelligence, holding out answers all for the sake of ratings, and after the very next episode, I think most people felt that was the nail in the coffin, and for all intents and purposes, who Negan really killed was you. But just as we had to wait to see who was killed next season, I'm gonna wait to explain my full thoughts on the cliffhanger in the next video. So for those of you who still leave comments on the other video and say that it's a good cliffhanger, I'm gonna tell you right now that you're wrong, and I'm gonna die on that hill. The season has some very high highs. One of the highest rated episodes, 4 of the top 10 best episodes, 2 very solid storylines that are done really well, but there are also far more negatives about this season than any other season that came before it. The biggest downfall with this season comes down to one thing, and that's how it treated its audience like we were stupid. My girlfriend and I now have an inside joke whenever we watch something that's in black and white, and we're like, oh, this must take place in the past since it's black and white. And that stems from this season of the show. They didn't trust that we were smart enough to know the difference between the present day and what was in the past. They killed off Glenn, but didn't actually give us confirmation. Talked about him so much in the episodes afterwards. They didn't have Stephen Yeun on Talking Dead, which they always did with principal cast members that died. It wasn't shocking that he was alive. And the fact that they thought it would be tells me that they think I'm stupid. They didn't want to wrap up the first half of the season with an episode like No Way Out because they didn't trust that I was going to want to see what happens after that, so they gave me a bullshit episode like start to finish, in which basically nothing of importance happens, so that way I'd stick around for more afterwards. And if you didn't like that tactic in the mid-season finale, guess what? They did it again in the actual season finale too. Audiences are smart, but when you treat us like we're dumb, it doesn't really make me want to come back for more. It's the sacrifice of art and storytelling for the business end of things, ratings and profits, and this season emphasized that more than ever before. Kinda proves that what ultimately killed the show was its own popularity and how people behind the scenes wanted to capitalize on it. So how can I possibly think this is the best season after that rant? The season came out when I was a senior in high school. At this point, all of my friends were watching the show. We'd have like Sunday night parties like it was the Super Bowl, and I have very fond memories watching this season. I also have a personal preference on the first half of the season with the herd of walkers. Kind of reminds me of the back half of season 4, and that was another portion of the show that I really loved. And I liked the build up to Negan and how it really felt like something bad and big was coming. The season hits all the right notes for me personally and strikes all the right emotional chords. Whether that be because of the storyline itself or because it reminds me of who I was and where I was at that point in my life. The season has far more problems than any of the others that have come before it. I understand and recognize that, but with my own bias added in, this season is a 10 out of 10. It's the gold standard for me. When I think about this season, I don't think about all the bad things I mentioned. I think about how much I liked both halves. I think back on the memories I have watching it for the first time and how this was my favorite and most enjoyable time watching The Walking Dead. And that rings true to this very day.
Who are you?
Negan.
Who are you?
Negan.
Who are you?
I'm Prison Mike!
So whenever I talk about this opening episode and subsequently the season 6 finale, I see a lot of people now who look back fondly on the cliffhanger, saying, oh, it was really great. It made people want to watch the next episode. Yeah, that was never the problem. This show always made you want to watch the next episode, whether there was a cliffhanger or not, but this new wave of Walking Dead fans over the last years who watch the show on Netflix and think of the season finale of season 6 and the season 7 opener as a wonderful two-parter. But the thing is, this wasn't a two-parter. Sure, it feels that way because it's seemingly written as a two-parter, but those of us who watched the show as it came out did not get to just click next episode. The season 6 finale gets a very bad rap because of the cliffhanger, and if you look at all the reviews, all the recent ones say, oh, it's a great episode with a great cliffhanger, but all the older fans, like myself, are still very hurt by this cliffhanger. And I will always defend my stance that this is a bad cliffhanger. call me bitter or salty or whatever, but this cliffhanger absolutely killed the show when it first came out and made fans lose faith in the show. Pair this with some other questionable things in season 6, like the Glenn fake-out death, the pacing breakup with Morgan's episode, Daryl getting shot in the episode before this and making us think he was going to be really hurt just for it to mean absolutely nothing. I mean, he literally never gets any on-screen help for this bullet wound. It just kind of disappears. There were a lot of moments of fabricated stakes or suspense, and the cliffhanger was the worst example of that. The moment the ratings dipped even the slightest in season 6, they wanted to do something to try and get a bunch of new audience members to watch, and I'll hand it to them. Their gimmick worked. For one episode. The season 7 premiere is the second highest viewed episode in the entire show. Why? Because people wanted to see who Negan killed, but once that question was answered, any new viewers the show was trying to pick up didn't go past this point because they were satisfied with the kills that they saw on screen. Wouldn't the better marketing question going into this season be, how is Rick gonna come back from all this? All of the marketing around this season was built around the first episode, and after that was over, it was kind of like, okay, now what? If we had seen Abraham die in the season 6 finale, market the show around Negan's regime and how our group can possibly defeat him, it would have, at the very least, given people a reason to stick around longer. And they could have opened the episode on Glenn's death and give people an even bigger reason to want to buy into how Rick and the group are going to come back from all this. Sure, you can think that this is a good cliffhanger. I don't, and I never will, because I think how the show was handled during this crucial time ultimately led to the loss of even more viewers. Oh, you're wondering what my thoughts are on the deaths, and I've made you wait a few minutes longer? Yeah, imagine that, but on a scale of several months. And several more minutes from when the episode starts, as if you haven't waited long enough. Now we have to rebuild all the stress of that moment, a moment that was executed to perfection the first time around, so let's just redo that scene, but from different angles. I gotta take a moment to shout out Big Man Abraham, who doesn't ever get the respect he deserves, almost like these two episodes were handled very poorly, I don't know. In retrospect, it's incredibly obvious that he would be Negan's pick. He doesn't cower away from him, he all but vocally volunteered to be this death, and he doesn't get nearly enough love or attention from this death. From this sacrifice. It flips his goodbye scene with Eugene because now it's farewell to Abraham and not Eugene like we thought, and that's honestly very clever writing. R.I.P. Abraham, you left a very big hole in the show when you left, and you're not talked about nearly as much as you should be. Also, what did the Sasha and Abraham romance do exactly? Why was it necessary for him to break up with Rosita and then be with Sasha? Abraham could have went on the exact same journey that he went on, but with Rosita. It's not like either one of these couples was particularly budding with chemistry, so why change it? Oh, because Sasha didn't have a storyline. Let's just have her be the love interest to...
Oh, I don't know. That guy.
So now we know who was killed. Alright, let's move on. Oh, no, wait, Daryl has to make the dumbest decision in the show and hit Negan with the arm that just hours earlier he was shot in the shoulder, so now we get the big death. Glenn's death was a big swing and a miss, not literally, but I don't blame them for doing it. It was what happened in the comics. They wanted to try and be faithful to the source material, and they said that they tried playing around with different storylines if he survived, but it affected too much of the story. I don't know how true that is, but I think that in a way, it made so much sense for it to be Glenn's character. The intent was for Glenn's death to be this hugely impactful death that the audience would want to see the downfall of Negan and put us in that place mentally that lusted for revenge, and on paper, I actually don't think that Abraham's death alone would have incited that. I think it had to be a character like Glenn or even Daryl to make us feel a strong enough hatred for Negan. Imagine if it had been Daryl. Would Academy Award nominated actor Steven Yeun be in a Glenn Rhee TV show instead? And Glenn's death did cause a huge impact on the show, but not the one that they were hoping for. While I often make fun of when the show highlights a character in their death episode or the episode right before their death, they didn't do that for Glenn, who is probably the biggest death in the entire show, but his final few episodes weren't really anything special. In his final episodes, he didn't get a very big scene with Maggie, he killed people, which was something he actively avoided doing throughout the entire apocalypse, and went out searching for Daryl just to find him and try to leave to go home. In the season 6 finale, Glenn has like 2 lines. In this episode, he had 1 line, so his last proper episode where he has a lot of screen time is in the episode East, but he doesn't particularly have a lot of lines or scenes in that episode either. Because of this, Glenn doesn't really get a complete character arc. And I hate the argument when people say, this is The Walking Dead, anybody can die at any time. You know a show that also totes that same line? Game of Thrones, yet all the main characters that die in that, at least in the first few seasons, have complete character arcs, and their deaths are for more than just shock value, they actually change the story. The reason why all these deaths in Game of Thrones work is because of how well paced each episode was. So let's move on to The Walking Dead Season 7's biggest enemy, pacing. Watching this season week to week was an absolute chore. I say this a lot in these videos, but from seasons 4 to 6, every Sunday in my house was like the Super Bowl because there were so many people coming over to watch the episode and talk about it afterwards, and by the end of season 7, there was me, my mom, my dad, and my best friend. From 15 to 20 people every week to 4. This was because most people stopped watching the show because they didn't care and it was too slow. We wanted to see Rick rally the troops and want to fight back, and it's kinda hard to do that when across the first half of the season, Rick is only in half of the episodes. We also get 5 of these 8 episodes that take place with one storyline in one location. We set up the kingdom, we set up the sanctuary, we set up Oceanside, we check in at Alexandria, we check in at the hilltop, and after these 5 episodes, we are barely further along than we were at the end of episode 1. None of these episodes have any particular standout moments other than character introductions, not to mention the tone of this season is just so wildly all over the place. The first half of season 6 felt urgent and emotional, and the stakes were very high. The second half felt like an impending doom was coming. Our characters were very confident, but the tone made us think that something was gonna go wrong very soon. Season 7 has all this setup for so many different things in the first half, and the second half has a bit more cohesion with coming together, but it still suffers from pacing and boomerang storytelling. But there is a good aspect to this season that the other seasons didn't have, and that is, of course, Negan, or should I say Jeffrey Dean Morgan as Negan. His charisma and performance gives us this character that we love to hate, and sure, I see some of the complaints that he's a big, over-the-top, cartoony villain, but I actually like that aspect, especially during this rewatch. I found myself really looking forward to his scenes, and then kinda looking at my phone to take all these notes when there were other episodes with storylines I didn't care about. So I'm just gonna rapid fire a few of my thoughts on these episodes in the first half of the season. Episode 2, I think Ezekiel and his over-the-top personality with Shiva and leading the kingdom is really great, and Carrie Payton is really great as Ezekiel. We also get Jerry, and who doesn't love Jerry? They also feed pigs walkers to trade to the saviors. Shouldn't this start a whole sickness arc once again at the sanctuary, like what happened at the prison? Episode 3, a lot of really interesting ideas in this episode. I think that Dwight had huge possibilities of becoming a great and fan-favorite character, and I like him in this episode. The idea of a captured Daryl and breaking him down to become one of Negan's men is also really interesting. It would have been absolutely incredible for Daryl to become a double agent and join Negan, and it's honestly really stupid that he didn't. The Sanctuary is an interesting place, and seeing how Negan runs it and how terrified people are gives you an additional feeling of hopelessness. But in terms of all the one storyline episodes, I actually think that this is probably the best one. Episode 4 proves that things get worse before they get better. This episode is almost more disheartening than the previous episodes, seeing everything that Rick and the Alexandrians have built all being taken over the course of a single afternoon. In a lot of ways, this episode is incredibly effective. Negan is equally charming and terrifying, and Rick is broken beyond repair. Anyone who had an issue with The Ones Who Live and how Rick acted in that show, and how Michonne had to come in and change his mind, how it's out of character for him, just do yourself a favor and rewatch this episode and this season in general. This episode also started Rosita having an actual character arc and presence in this story outside of being a love interest, and I sure hope that that continues. I also think this would have been better had Daryl shown up being part of the Saviors with both Rick and the audience not yet knowing he's undercover. Episode 5. I guess it's cool to check in on Maggie on the hilltop, see her confront Gregory, but I don't particularly care about this Carl and Enid romance, and this is overall a pretty uneventful episode. Episode 6. This was at one point the lowest rated episode of the series, but honestly, I had more fun watching this episode than I did the last one. It's very obvious with the amount of guns that these women have, where the direction of the story is going from here, and again, I think that this could have been combined with like the last 4 episodes for them to all make 2 episodes with all this information and multiple storylines, and the show wouldn't have felt as slow as it is. It's also a famous episode for being Heath's last appearance and the first appearance of the PPP card, both of which we're still waiting for some sort of resolution to, and this episode came out in 2017. Episode 7. This is actually a good episode. Rosita having an actual character arc is making me think differently of her this time around. I think Carl going on a suicide mission to the sanctuary offers a lot of great moments and offers the full glimpse of the storyline AMC wants us all to forget. Again, I think this sets up a really great dynamic between Negan and Carl, and it's followed through for the next episode, and they say that it follows through in storylines and episodes after that, but it really doesn't. It's also the first bit of humanity that we see out of Negan with how he treats Carl. Episode 8, definitely the second best episode of the season. I had forgotten how great of a character Gregory is. Great in the sense that he's despicable and I hate everything about him, but that also makes for a great character, and people don't think about that one too much. You need hateable characters just as much as you need lovable characters, and Gregory fills that itch more than maybe any other character in the show does. This episode also has all storylines, which is fantastic. It makes the pacing much better and shouldn't be delegated to something only mid-season finales or big episodes have. But The Walking Dead had largely forgotten that at this point. This episode also has the most ridiculous moment in all of The Walking Dead, and that's when Rosita misses her shot and it hits Lucille instead. Maybe this is why I don't like Rosita, because when she gets interesting, she contributes to the worst scene in the series. And I mean that this is the dumbest scene, the odds of this ever happening are insane, and it feels like this scene is out of a cartoon. Also, why would Negan think that somebody made this bullet? Why not that somebody found it? Negan is smart, but he's definitely not smart enough to know the difference between an actual bullet and then one that was recently made. I don't care what you tell me, it seems like something that was convenient for the plot, so they just kinda went with it. But hey, at least at the end of this episode, we see the group come together to finally want to start trying to fight back. We get the emotional reunion between Daryl and Rick, which I'm hoping we'll get to see a similar scene sometime soon, and Daryl giving back the Colt Python to Rick, which is great symbolism, probably one of the best scenes in the series. So that marks the halfway point of the season. Let's go over what happened, shall we? Glenn and Abraham die. Carol and Morgan learn about the kingdom. Daryl is a prisoner. Tara learns about Oceanside. Alexandria gets robbed. Maggie is sad. Carl and Rosita want to fight back against Negan, though they both fail. Daryl escapes, Negan feeds Carl spaghetti, the group wants to fight back. That's it, and that doesn't sound like enough to fill half a season. In fact, that sounds like the synopsis for like an episode or 2 of the show. Am I exaggerating to make a point right now? Yes, I am, but even if I went through a very detailed point-by-point progression of the story, it would be far less than anything that happened in any half season before this. This half of the season really only set up what we already knew was going to happen, the group finding the will to fight back. But now that we're all at this point, it's time for a break. Now, I'm not saying that this is a badly written season. I actually think that splitting up the group into different communities and homes is really interesting and allows us to see the broader approach of the world. I think that the story and the events that transpire lead to a pretty natural reaction from everybody to gather that courage and want to fight back, but there's also a lot of scenes that could have been cut out and the story would remain the same. Did we really need to see multiple different scenes of Daryl getting tortured to see the point? Did we need an entire episode about Negan stopping by Alexandria to take their stuff? Multiple scenes of Carol saying that she's done fighting and wants to be left alone? There is so much excess fat in these episodes that, if they were slimmed down and combined, could have made for some really great episodes of television. If some of the fat of the scenes was trimmed down and we get this whole reunion, say, at the end of episode 5, go into the groups all meeting and their first fight with the Saviors be the mid-season finale, the second half covering the start of All Out War could have been the greatest season in all of The Walking Dead. But that's not what happened, so let's take it back a bit and go over the second half of season 7. Again, rapid fire thoughts on each episode. Episode 9, it's cool to see everybody meeting, but the plot kinda stalls when Ezekiel says no to helping them. The first half of the season was spent setting up why they all need to fight, including the Kingdom, but no, the plot still needs to stall and there has to be some more holdout. The scene of getting the explosives and the whole line of walkers getting split in half is really cool. It's a little silly, but it's really cool, and honestly something I forgot about until watching this episode again. Episode 10. The trash people. What a sign of the times this was. When the show started turning into trash, we meet the people associated with it. I absolutely hate how they all talk like Kevin from The Office in that one episode.
So me think, why waste time? Say lot word when few word do trick.
Gabriel also proved this season how far he's come, and he became one of the best characters in the show. I mean, that's not that hard because this season especially feels so empty. I think it's the combination of two fan favorites being gone and everybody being separated and the overall vibes being really low, but the season has a sort of emptiness to it that I can't quite explain. It reminds me of some people's complaints on The Last of Us Part 2, how it just makes you feel miserable so you don't want to play it. I think that's a very valid criticism, and one that I share when it comes to this season of The Walking Dead. Episode 11. So, I didn't remember this episode. Not in the sense that I had forgotten the events of it, I just straight up did not remember anything about this episode because I don't think I've ever watched it. I don't know how it's possible because I was watching this week to week when it was coming out, but maybe at this point I was starting to not care and accidentally missed a week, but watching this episode for what is probably the first time, I really enjoyed it. Maybe that's just me speaking from the point of view that it's like I got to see a new episode of the show, or maybe this is just a good episode. I remember thinking that both Eugene and Dwight's turn was really quick, but maybe that's because I never saw this episode. This episode actually sets up and makes both of their turns really well done, and you can see where both of them are coming from and why they make the decisions that they do. So overall, pretty great. Episode 12. This is a very famous or infamous episode because of one thing. The CGI deer. Compared to previous episode 12s and even future episode 12s, this one is a stinker. This is primarily focused on showing us the Rick and Michonne chemistry, so I guess in that regard it is a pretty important episode, but we also see Tara contemplating telling the others about Oceanside, and honestly, I like this storyline. I like that there's this dark horse community that could solve all their issues and how somebody has to deal with the decision to inform the rest of the community or not. The execution, I feel, could be better, but on paper, I still like it. But this episode is super cheesy and makes me be like, okay, what is this show turning into? It also shows us how stupid walkers have become and how they aren't even really a threat anymore, they're just an obstacle, literally, for this episode. Episode 13, you can add Benjamin to the list of characters who get a bunch of screen time in the episode that they're killed off in. I don't think this is a bad episode, but this is also the episode that changed the course of the series for the worse. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now. I'll get more into this whole conversation that I've been building up to for the past 3 videos now when I cover season 8. Also, we're 3 episodes from the finale, and it's taken this long for everybody to agree to want to fight back. What is this season? I honestly hate the whole Rosita and Sasha frenemies storyline. I didn't buy into either of their relationships with Abraham, so I just don't think any of this is entirely necessary. I actually think it would be a better storyline if it didn't have this whole black cloud of both of them dating Abraham over it. Also, a whole nother episode doing the same hiding from the saviors gimmick that we already saw in a different episode this season. Watching these last couple episodes has been an absolute painful experience, and I can see why the show lost its charm on me and so many other people starting with this season. If I didn't know the show got better as it went on, this would be a hard show to continue, even from a binge watching standpoint. Episode 15, I think this is another example for the people who think that the group aren't the good guys. Yes, they do have good intentions, but they're still coming to another group and stealing quite literally every gun they have, exactly what the Saviors did to them earlier in the season. Sasha pretending to join Negan and going along with everything just to try and get her opening to strike makes me really appreciate Sasha's character and like her a lot more, which is unfortunate because this is ultimately what leads to her death. But another pretty great episode. Why? Because it has multiple storylines in one episode. I feel like this is a trend. Every good episode this season has multiple points of view. It's almost like pacing in a story, and moving the story forward is important. And Dwight switching sides is such a great storyline, and it comes way too late into the season. Episode 16, we get a flashback of Abraham. Dwight's confrontation scene is great. Tara straight up wants him dead, Daryl wants to kill him because of his own personal reasons, and Rick is kind of just letting this happen because he knows that Daryl needs this moment, and when Daryl lowers the knife, Rick immediately steps up to take control again. I actually think that this is a great written scene and shows so much between the characters but doesn't tell you how to feel or what it is they're doing. This is something that was lost this season, but was present in every other season before this. While the pacing of this episode is good, and it does bring together everyone and everything from this season, it also feels very bland. This episode feels like it could have and should have been the mid-season finale, and it would have been better, but still not great. I absolutely cannot get over how stupid this final fight is. It has some cool stuff like Shiva and the trash people switching sides was a good twist, but this whole fight feels like something from a completely different show. Pair that with the horrible choreography and the absolutely ridiculous music that is way too over the top with like magical whimsy. It sounds like something from Harry Potter. The season does end not really on a cliffhanger, but on a scene that makes you want more. They're going to war, and we're excited to see that, at least for those of us that have stuck around. Overall, I thought maybe with some time I'd look back at this season more fondly, but if anything, the exact opposite happened. I enjoyed the season even less than I did the first time around. I think the first time around I was just hoping for the season to finally hit its stride and that, oh, maybe next week's episode would be better. But knowing how I felt about this season going into it and knowing that this whole season is just an utter mess, it made watching it for the second time a far less enjoyable experience than I had hoped. There's a lot of great ideas presented in this season. The introduction to all the other communities with double agents involved, seeing different members who haven't had prominent roles in the past get a bigger role here because they're the ones who want to fight back. It all sounds really great on paper, and some of it is executed very well, but to me, I think the negatives far outweigh the positives in this season. And that's a very strange opinion to have, considering I think Season 6 is the best season of the show. Having the one right after it be the worst season is almost unheard of. But when the thing people remember the most from this season is the premiere episode, it's like everything else after that single hour is just downhill. Pair the marketing with the emptiness that this season fills you with, and you have a pretty forgettable season of television. After this first episode, you can literally just be like, so the rest of the season is about them banding together and wanting to fight back, and then just skip to Season 8. Now I know, because I typically have a pretty positive outlook on this show, that this video might make a lot of people angry. And I am sorry for that, but I also wasn't about to make a video talking about like the 3 things that I enjoyed from this season and just leave out my thoughts on all the bad. So prepare your keyboards, everyone, because my rating for this season of The Walking Dead is a 5.5 out of 10. So the first episode of the season is actually the show's 100th episode. There's some really cool callbacks and references to the first episode of the show, but with Carl instead of Rick, and I think that this is a nice touch, so well done, Season 8. It's also kind of setting up how Carl is going to be one day in Rick's position, alone and without his father, so I'm seeing this scene as a sorta intro for when Carl inevitably takes over as the show's main character. Anyways, the first several minutes are really confusing the first time you're watching it. Rick is giving some speech to the people, he sees some glimmering tree in the distance, and then he's sweating and crying, then he's by Glenn and Abraham's graves, then he's an old man, and then he's back to the speech, and first-time viewers of this scene are lost on so many different levels. And not lost in the sense that you're like, whoa, I wonder what this means. Lost in the sense that you're just like, okay, what's going on here? Then we continue on, and that feeling doesn't end. There's so little context as to what's going on, the actual timeline of the episode, when we're in the past, the present, the future, or really what anybody is actually doing. We can gather that they're on some sort of planned out mission, but we don't know what this mission is, when all of this is happening, and this is just one of the issues that I have with this season, but it's a big one, and that's the editing. I'll touch more on that in a few minutes. Let's go to the group wasting all their bullets at the sanctuary. Rick stares down Negan, who's less than 50 yards away from him, starts shooting at him, cut to commercial. Then Negan just dodges these bullets and jumps out of the way. Okay, sure. Then everybody else continues firing. At the building? What's the point of this? What if all these innocent people that they're trying to save were up in these windows? We didn't see any saviors poking their heads out from the windows. Literally just an insert shot of like a rifle hanging out from the windows would have saved, well, this portion of the scene. This is just a waste of ammo, right along with their coordinated gunfire salute or something like that they did earlier, which is yet another huge issue with this season. Sure, there's lots of action, but the bullets only hit their targets like 5% of the time, honestly probably even less than that. When last season made such a big emphasis on the amount of ammunition that both sides have, and gave Eugene this elevated role because he knew how to make bullets, for over half this season, ammo doesn't seem to be even a slight concern for anyone. I mean, where do they... Oh, wait, Daryl actually gets a max ammo right here, never mind. The ending of the episode ends with another reference to the end of the first episode. That's all nice, but it also ends with even more timeline shuffling and confusing editing. I've talked a number of times about how my girlfriend is watching the show with me for the first time, and I could tell that she was just mentally checked out for this episode. She said that this was by far the worst episode of the show, and from what she has seen so far, I don't disagree. This first episode did not live up to the legendary episode 100 title that other shows have. This feels like an entirely different show. Like this season had a different editor, or like it was just trying to be really different and really artistic indie movie vibes, and it doesn't come across well whatsoever. Now let's talk about this all-out war, one of the most important arcs of the comics and to this storyline overall. This season is at its best when the fight scenes aren't about the good guys taking down the bad guys, but when it shows the gray sides of this conflict and how the war really isn't good for anyone. All the yay, bam bam, now look, the bad guys are dead scenes are insanely boring to watch, and unfortunately that's most of the season. Scenes like Rick killing the savior that was ultimately just trying to protect his child is the type of shit that I wanted to see more of. Rick was all in on killing every savior he came across, but seeing a father do everything he could, not to take out Rick, but to save his child, gives Rick second thoughts on his actions, and that's the stuff that's incredibly powerful to see. That's what this war should have consisted of. This is a dark story about how humans react and treat each other in the zombie apocalypse. This is not a Marvel movie where the good guys and the bad guys are so clearly defined. This war should be horrific and traumatic. And while some moments in this season get this aspect right, the majority of the actual war is just bland action sequence after bland action sequence of our characters killing the saviors mercilessly and really without remorse. None of them have any sort of like PTSD from this war. Nothing is really treated with a big amount of weight behind it. This war just feels hollow. Morales comes back in the show. Woohoo, I can't wait to see what he's been up to. Oh, he's dead. No, but for real, I actually really enjoyed this episode and this aspect of the season. Again, it's another side of how gray this conflict is, even just ever so slightly for a few minutes. Rick tries to convince Morales to come back with him and that he's right, but just because they spent time with each other at the start doesn't really mean that they owe each other anything. Times have changed and allegiances have shifted. The saviors were there for Morales when he didn't have anything. He sees no reason why he should go and join Rick, even if he is ever so slightly standing on higher moral ground. Morales' life with the saviors has been steady and safe until Rick started all of this, so from Morales' point of view, even though he spent time with Rick and liked him, he's the bad guy now. But what could have been an incredibly powerful storyline and message being told through his character, they just kill him off. Don't you guys think it would be better if we keep Morales around for a little while?
Don't matter. Not one little bit.
Ezekiel's character is an aspect that this season gets right. The episode Some Guy is actually really strong thematically and shows this aspect of war that is hard to deal with. Ezekiel thinks that his personality and his speech will be enough to overcome their challenge on the mission, and it turns out that his leadership and ability to get people so hyped up for this mission ultimately leads them to their deaths. He's not a king, he's just some guy. Pair that with the death of his tiger Shiva, and this turns out to be a very metaphorical death for Ezekiel that changes him. I can't wait to see how this war changes other characters, cause surely other characters besides Rick are gonna change too, right? In terms of the actual structure of the war throughout the season, it starts off with Rick and the group winning all of their fights, then the saviors strike back, and by the mid-season, the saviors are kinda on top, then it goes back to Rick and the group on top, and then Rick going sicko mode with Morgan. The saviors come back, and then heading into the final battle, the saviors kind of have the upper hand until Eugene pulls off his party trick. I do like this back and forth between who's winning at what time. I just wish that there was a bit more nuance involved with this whole storyline. Now, before I get to the big aspect of the season, let's talk about Rick. On paper, this season has the best Rick Grimes character arc in the entire show. It starts out with him having literally no mercy, putting other people's lives in jeopardy just to try and land the final blow on Negan, realizing that he can't, and then taking a picture of what they've done, just like the Saviors did for Glenn and Abraham. To Rick, the Saviors aren't people. They're the same as walkers, they just have guns now that don't hit their targets. Rick might as well be Cal Kestis, killing stormtroopers. Actually, you know what? Rick might as well be Starkiller killing stormtroopers with how OP he is compared to the enemies around him. But then something happens at the mid-season that ends up changing Rick's mind. He avoids his grief and the message that his son was trying to share with them so that way he can continue his kill streak, but before he gets to drop a nuke, he ultimately realizes that Carl is right and he needs to honor the wishes of his son. He lets his emotions get the better of him again, but ultimately ends up sparing Negan. The grief and loss he's faced in this war almost too much for him to handle. Now, saying all of this makes me think that this season must have been really great, because I love this arc for Rick on paper. I think that the execution is alright, certainly the best part of the season, but it's also not entirely present for most of the season. These Rick moments are few and far between, and when they happen, they're great, but it doesn't outweigh the rest of the horrible writing of the season. In a way, this season feels very much ahead of its time, because this season very much feels like it was made to be binge-watched. And as a binge watch, it's still bad, but it's not as bad. But this argument doesn't really matter because this was still a show that was released week to week. Even if most viewers of the show nowadays don't experience it that way, watching this season week to week was boring. Same as Season 7, but this went in the opposite direction of Season 7. There was so little action in Season 7 and it was so slow that basically nothing happened. In Season 8 you get battle fatigue because so much happens, but at the same time only a few things of importance actually happen. I talked about it a bit, but let's talk about the biggest enemy of the season, the editing. This season is edited horribly. It feels like it's trying to be very artistic and clever, but it comes across as laughably bad. I talked about the weird pacing and cuts of the first episode, but in episode 2 there's these weird close-ups of all the characters' faces for like absolutely no reason, and it goes on for way too long. And then in the third episode, we get these weird flashbacks that fade to black that happened like moments before the scene that just happened. Like, just put these scenes in order. There's no suspense here just because you're bouncing back and forth between scenes that happened like 5 minutes apart. The season is absolutely filled with these strange, creative editing choices, and they on absolutely no level work for me, even the tiniest bit. These choices are what made this season feel so different, especially on a binge through the series. Season 7 was bad, yes, but it still felt like the same show. This season feels like it's a student project that had way too high of a budget. I bring up Student Project because let's talk about the other bad aspect of the season, the choreography. The fight choreography is absolutely atrocious. Some of these fight scenes last for like hours in world when it was supposed to be like a group of 24 people shooting at each other. Surely one of them would run out of bullets at some point, or one side would win? I'm saying that this is like among the worst gun choreography in any major title I've ever seen. People shoot bullets like the zombies will eventually drop a max ammo, and I'm not entirely convinced that they don't, because the amount of bullets they fire in this season, especially bullets that don't hit anything, is laughable. Alright, it's time for the big conversation. The reason why Season 8 is often brought up in conversations of worst seasons, conversations of worst decisions that the writers ever made, and the reason why a lot of people stopped watching the show. And that's, of course, the death of Carl Grimes. I mentioned earlier that I think Carl's death does actually do something for Rick Grimes' character arc on paper, and the way that the story plays out, it does make sense. However, this was not the original plan for this season, and I can do everything I can to prove it to you without giving you confirmation on it. I've been alluding to this conversation for the past few videos now, so finally, I'm gonna get into it. Let's talk about Carl and his character arc up to this point. Carl's a kid who grew up in the zombie apocalypse. He didn't get the childhood that any of us watching had. He was forced to grow up much quicker than literally everybody else around him. So he did. He could handle himself when it came to walkers. He was more of an adult than any of the teenagers when they arrived in Alexandria, going all the way to Season 7, when Carl quite literally risks his own life to go on a solo mission to take down Negan. That mission didn't work, but he was one of the primary factors for why Rick changed his mind and realized that he needed to fight Negan. He helped them get the guns from Oceanside and was prepared to fight Negan along with everybody else, and had it not been for a last-minute save from Shiva the Tiger, Carl would be a goner. By the way, this is definitely a moment that the show wants you to forget about, but make no mistake, Negan was going to kill Carl in this scene. So with all of this happening to Carl, surely in Season 8 he would have more elevated feelings of killing the saviors and wanting to participate in this war. Well, that's not what happens at all. This character, who's been going down a dark path the entire series up to this point, and who just went on a solo mission of revenge the season prior, is now a believer in peace and how this war can be settled formally if they all just talked it out.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
Now this sounds an awful lot like the mindset that a different character had for a long time, and that character is Morgan. When Morgan was reintroduced in the show in Season 5, he was far different from the crazy man that we had seen the last time he was on screen. In Season 6, when Morgan became part of the main cast, he believed that all life is precious. He couldn't bring himself to kill the wolves, he couldn't go on the mission to the satellite station, and wanted to try and end this conflict before it even began by communicating with Negan and the Saviors. These are all traits that Season 8 Carl possesses, and this is because Morgan was supposed to be the one to die this season, not Carl. You see, something changed during the time between Seasons 7 and 8, possibly even earlier, but thematically, it would have made perfect sense for Morgan's character to be the reason why Rick would change his mind about Negan. Let's go back to the satellite station episode for a moment. Instead of going on this raid, Morgan stays behind in that episode. To do what, you ask? To build a cell that would eventually house Negan for years. Later on in this season, Rick and Morgan have a great moment in the episode East, where Morgan makes Rick reconsider his whole "I don't take chances anymore" mentality, and it actually takes an effect on Rick in that moment. I believe this scene was here to set up the eventual change that Morgan's character would have on Rick after his death, for Rick to then see the value in everybody's life. There was only one pretty small issue with Morgan's death having this effect, and that's the fact that Rick and Morgan weren't friends. This conversation that they have in season 6 is one of the last conversations that they have in general. They're separated for most of season 7, so when it came to writing season 8 with this plan that they had in mind, it wouldn't really make narrative sense for Rick to change his ways just because somebody he knew back at the start wanted him to change. Morgan returning to the story didn't really have an effect on Rick, and Morgan's entire journey in season 8 is about becoming a killer again, and then realizing that he wanted to get away from everybody. So where does he go? Over to Fear the Walking Dead. I said that AMC was in crisis management mode going into this season, and it wasn't just because their ultra-hit show was declining in popularity, it was because their spin-off show wasn't doing too well either. So with the story that they had initially outlined, Morgan dying to change Rick's mind, not working well on paper, they made two drastic decisions: shipping Morgan over to Fear the Walking Dead in hopes that it would increase its viewership, and making Carl the death that would ultimately change Rick's mind about the war with Negan. I think this is why Chandler Riggs and his family have come out and said that the actor felt blindsided by the decision to kill off Carl, because it really was last minute in terms of the overall storyline. Now, this decision could also have been made because of Chandler Riggs turning 18 and them not wanting to pay him as an adult. Many things can be true at once. Maybe the producers and everybody behind the show felt that this was the perfect storm of events. To raise viewership and Fear, not have to pay one of their principal characters an adult salary, and service Rick's story in this season to make it flow more naturally. Except none of this worked out in The Walking Dead's favor. Everyone who watches Fear the Walking Dead says that anything after season 3 isn't really worth watching, so Morgan's presence really didn't help much there, and Carl's death didn't have the impact that they hoped it would either. For a lot of fans, this was truly when the show jumped the shark, the final nail in the coffin that ended their love and viewership for a once great show. So that's it. That's what I think happened. I think that at first it was supposed to be Morgan who was going to die, and then that death would change Rick's mind about sparing Negan, because Rick would kind of adopt the mindset that all life is precious. But Morgan eventually abandons this whole idea in season 7, and then also Rick and Morgan aren't good friends anyway, so his death wouldn't really change Rick at all. So to make it make sense, they changed the big death of season 8 from Morgan to Carl. Maybe I've been hyping this up too much, but I've never actually seen anybody connect the dots in this sense before, and to me, I think that it all makes perfect sense and aligns with everything that was happening in the show and this universe in general. But I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. So yeah, season 8 is not very good. It feels like a completely different show. The editing and choreography are atrocious. Carl's death was the show's biggest misstep they could have ever taken, and despite a really great character arc for Rick, there's basically no other redeeming qualities. Solely for Rick's story in this season, I'll give season 8 a 3 out of 10. So like I said, AMC went full on with the marketing around Rick's departure from the show. They didn't even try to sugarcoat anything. They were like, he's going to be in 5 episodes, and I remember watching the broadcast of the 5th and final episode, and there was this big dramatic, "And now, here is Rick Grimes' final episode." It was this huge event that they were building up, and for the most part, I think they nailed it. But before we get to that episode, let's talk about the previous 4. The first episode is titled A New Beginning, which is a very in-your-face way of AMC telling the audience, you know, all that stuff that you didn't like about season 7 and 8, yeah, that's done now, we're starting fresh. And that truly is a promise that they delivered on in these 5 episodes. These first 5 episodes really broke the mold that The Walking Dead had gotten so accustomed to. Find a home, find a villain, battle, leave home to find a new one, rinse and repeat. This was the first time that their home wasn't abandoned, and Alexandria, along with all the other new communities, stood intact. There was no major villain in these episodes. Everything was about trying to live alongside each other and the drama that came with it. And quite honestly, this 5-episode stretch is some of my favorite Walking Dead ever. Rick has entered a new era. The murder jacket is put away, he has a new haircut and looks far older than he has any right to look, especially since 10 years from now, he looks way younger. I saw a comment the other day and I thought it was very appropriate. Rick in Season 9 is in his Yoda era. He's old and wise, and everybody looks to him for answers, despite a few people around him with other plans. I really love seeing how hard Rick works to keep everybody in check, including his very best pals like Daryl and Maggie, who aren't exactly happy with the way that things have played out since they won the war. You can really feel the tension between the communities and the ex-saviors, and there's this air of suspense and caution because it really feels like everything is hanging on by a thread. They're trying to create a new beginning, sure, but all of this is really just one bad day away from imploding. And stuff does go wrong. The ex-saviors pick fights with people, everyday chores and work get difficult because of the walkers, the construction of the bridge is incredibly difficult because of all the different ideals surrounding it, and Rick is really the guy keeping all of this together. Rick tells Negan that even though there are bad days, they're gonna get through them, and Negan kinda doubts that, and in the end, he actually ends up right about it. There are, of course, some other prominent storylines besides Rick, namely Maggie and Daryl being upset with how everything has been handled and wanting to take things into their own hands. Maggie, of course, wants revenge against Negan. Him rotting in a cell for the rest of his life isn't good enough for her, and Daryl is on the same page. It took me until this rewatch to be like, wait, why is Daryl on the same page as Maggie? Daryl is upset with Rick about his role at the sanctuary because Daryl doesn't want to be a leader of any kind. He's still angry with how the decisions to include the saviors have gone down, especially since he sees sides to them that Rick doesn't see. But all of this seems pretty surface level to me. On a deeper level, I feel like Daryl still holds a grudge against not only Negan, but all of the saviors for his pain and torture during Season 7. And even beyond that, Daryl still feels responsible for Glenn's death, so to pair him up with Maggie on the quest for revenge is a really great storyline and makes for some great scenes with Rick and Daryl at odds with each other. Jadis is also a pretty big character in these 5 episodes, getting close with Father Gabriel, and this ends up being a pretty impactful and important relationship even a ways down the road. While these episodes are primarily focused on Rick for obvious reasons, there's also a good amount of seeds being planted here for the time he's gone. Like I said, Rick is the person that's holding all of these communities together, and it's only hanging on by a thread. When he's gone, none of this lasts. Daryl doesn't want to be a leader, and that was really emphasized in these episodes because it would have been really easy to just give Daryl all of Rick's storylines from here on out and make him Rick 2.0, but that doesn't happen either. And now, we talk about
Rick Grimes' last episode.
This episode is pretty damn good. It also broke the only important stuff happens in episodes 1, 8, 9, and 16 structure that the previous seasons had been using pretty egregiously. I've gone more in depth about this episode in another analysis, but this episode has just about everything you could want from Rick Grimes' final episode. We get flashbacks of Shane and Herschel and Sasha because they couldn't get Stephen Yeun back. And all of these, particularly the scene with Herschel, are incredibly powerful and emotional. Rick gets some final axe kills and a hero moment blowing up the bridge, and it's all very meaningful and symbolic. Daryl stands by Rick one last time, essentially taking the torch as the show's new leading man. The bridge that took all of Rick's influence and power to get built as a way to bring the communities together is destroyed, along with any hope for the future. And of course, they weren't actually going to kill off Rick Grimes, so they had him defy the laws of physics, be blown somehow into the water, and he gets charted off in a helicopter with the promise that we'll see him again in a Rick Grimes movie trilogy. Oh boy, I can't wait to watch that. This is also the final episode for a very long time for Maggie, although that was kept a secret until after this episode aired, maybe not to take away from Rick's spotlight, but also if they were like, yeah, so actually 2 main characters are gone after this. That might have turned even more people away, so they just kept that one a secret. But she also goes through a great story arc in these 5 episodes, from wanting to take matters into her own hands and become some ruthless leader, to realizing that Rick's plan was right all along. Daryl also comes to a similar conclusion, but they're never actually able to tell Rick this, which is another really tragic part of the episode. And to end the episode off, we get a Marvel-esque scene teasing the rest of the season with grown-up Judith and a new cast of characters. So these 5 episodes are basically a mini season of their own, but I also think that the way they handled all of this was incredibly smart. If this had gone to the mid-season finale, with the long break in between everything, that would have been sayonara for a lot of fans. But there was still 3 more episodes, which is 3 episodes to hook your audience on whatever new story you're telling, and they definitely did that. This reminds me a lot of when Michael Scott left The Office, and they did the same thing there. They didn't have his final episode be the finale, because then a year break might just dissuade people from watching the next season. They wanted people to see how the show would continue without this main character, and by doing so, they still kept a large portion of the audience. But losing Rick had a lot of in-world consequences, and I absolutely love how everything was handled in this Rickless world. The writers had a few different avenues to go down. There was the easiest route, which is just what I said earlier, make Daryl Rick 2.0, have him realize that he actually does need to step up and he does need to be a leader and take Rick's place. And I'm quite frankly a little surprised that they didn't do that, but I'm glad they didn't, because no matter what, Daryl isn't Rick. Even if Daryl is a leader, his leading style is not Rick's style. Daryl isn't going to give a big rallying speech. He might quietly inspire those around him, but he's not going to be the guy to hype everybody up. Some people don't take to his style of leadership, and that's fine because that's entirely in line with who Daryl is. So while Daryl took over as the lead character, he still remained true to who he was. The writers didn't change him for this season, but because they did this, they also had to change a lot about the upcoming storylines. So how did they do this? They introduced a whole lot of mystery and a time jump. We get very little context about the past in this time jump, although clearly a lot of things worked out well for everybody in these 6 years because everybody's still alive and well. But also, the group and Rick's found family have never been further apart. People like Michonne and Carol are barely on speaking terms anymore. There's all this mystery around what actually went down between the communities, and that's certainly explored later in the season, but it makes for a really intriguing storyline that we want to see the answers to. Throw in the scars on both Michonne and Daryl, and we have even more reasons to stick around. But mainly, what all of this does is cement how much of an impact Rick had on all of these people, and how the writers were really respecting his departure with all these decisions while still making the show interesting to watch, mainly because Rick is no longer around and how different things have become without him. It's incredibly smart writing and really well done by the showrunner and the writers, and I know this season gets a lot of credit, but I still think it deserves more because of just how many obstacles this season had to overcome to be as good as it is. However, not all of the writing decisions were great writing decisions. So let's talk about the introduction of this whole new group of people. A lot of people refer to them as Magna's group, which seems appropriate for season 9 because Magna really does seem like the leader in this season, until she goes on to do absolutely nothing for the rest of the series. I suppose a lot of my criticisms for this group comes from seasons 10 and 11, so I'll get to my issues with them there, but in this season, I don't really have too big of a problem with any of them individually. One of my favorite storylines to come out of this time jump is the friendship between Judith and Negan. Seeing all these relationships wavering in the time jump, it's also nice to see one that's thriving and how different Negan is after all these years in his cell. He's still a pompous ass, but we see more than ever just how fake his whole persona is, because when he's talking with Judith, that's the real Negan, and all these years in the cell has forced him to lower his guard quite a bit. This time jump also allowed the show to change identities. There's very little ammunition, so everybody is taken more kindly to melee weapons and bows. All of the fuel they find must go towards Daryl's bike, even though the fuel probably shouldn't even be good anymore. But Daryl needs to have his bike, so just go with it. They use horses and carriages to get around now. The music went from really dramatic synthwave to more classic western, and all of these changes offered up new ways to tell the story. There's also plenty of changes to the characters, like Eugene just now being a total badass, Aaron looking like a comic book version of Rick Grimes, Rosita and Father Gabriel being together, long-haired Carol, and a lot of this stuff is just kind of glanced over, as it would be in-universe, because these people have evolved since the last time we saw them. And speaking of things evolving in this universe, there's a reason why the story picks up 6 years later and not in between when everything was all sunshine and rainbows. And that's because there's a little something different about the walkers now. They're moving a little bit differently now, apparently whispering to each other. It seems that instead of rotting away completely, the walkers have evolved into something more frightening. The music is eerie, the tone surrounding the walkers changes into something more threatening and menacing once again, and I really liked how this whole introduction to the Whisperers was done. This aspect brought horror back to The Walking Dead and back to the walkers, something that had been missing for quite some time. The whole episode, Evolution, is really well done in terms of bringing the horror back to The Walking Dead, but it's also a victim of one of The Walking Dead's biggest problems, and that's the highlighting of a character in the episode you're gonna kill them off in. I knew pretty early into the episode, without getting spoiled, I watched this episode as it aired, with it being a mid-season finale and all, that Jesus was gonna be killed off. He was given way too much focus, especially being talked about as some new political leader of Hilltop and being promised a bigger role going forward. Same things happened with Noah and Denise and even Glenn to a certain extent, so Jesus' death was pretty obvious to me. The actual death scene and reveal of the Whisperers is really well done, but why couldn't this have been like any of the new characters besides Connie? It would have brought that group closer to our primary group and saved Jesus to have a more prominent role. I suppose they wanted to shock to be more of a big deal, and this was back when the show would actually kill off its main characters, something that they outright refuse to do now, so I guess I gotta give it a pass. But this reveal of people using the walkers to blend in and move around is a really great choice for the next villain of this series, especially with there being a time jump of 6 years in the future. You either still want to cling on to the society that you knew before the apocalypse, or you adapt to the world as it is now, and this parallel between these two sides gets greater as the season moves on. I like the Whisperers a lot as villains, both in the show and the comics. I think they're really creepy, particularly in this season, and brought in an exciting new element to the show overall. Being able to manipulate what is the biggest army on the planet against the survivors is a really great avenue that the show got to explore, and I think for this season it was handled really well. The Whisperers, of course, end up bringing the groups back together, setting aside their differences, and also planning a party to secure the relationship between the communities. And whenever there's some big event planned like this in any TV show, you just know that when that day comes,
it's about to go down.
But things really get underway when the group finds Lydia. The whole dilemma with this group, mainly Daryl, wanting to save this young girl from her mother and the Whisperers as a whole, presents a really interesting conflict between the Whisperers and the survivors. On one hand, if they just hand Lydia over to the Whisperers, they might just be left alone to what is quite possibly the most dangerous enemy they've ever faced. On the other hand, Daryl's a big ol' softy on the inside, and he wants to save this girl. And our group really isn't comfortable with giving this girl up, or what to do in this situation. It's at this time the absence of Rick Grimes really feels big to me, but almost in a good way. Taking the comics away from this whole storyline, because the stories deviate quite a bit from here on out between the comics and the show, and taking away what Rick does in the comics, it's times like this where everybody looked to Rick on what to do. He would have a definitive answer one way or another. No, we're not giving you the girl, so bring it on. Or yeah, sure, you can have her, now leave us alone. But because nobody is really comfortable with this decision or how to handle the Whisperers, we get the rest of the season to play out the way it does. Of course, one of the biggest characters in this season is Henry, and I feel like he gets a bit more hate than is necessary. I never really had a problem with Henry personally. Yes, it was very obvious that he was the replacement Carl with his entire storyline with Lydia, And Carl being gone still left a sour taste in people's mouths, so when you have this new teenager who gets a lot of screen time, gets all of Comic Carl storylines, it's easy to look at him and be like,
you're supposed to be Carl, but you're not, and I hate you for it.
But as a character overall, I don't mind Henry. I've expressed before how I don't really care for any of the teenager-centric storylines in this show, and that definitely continues with this season. I just don't think the writers knew how to write teenagers in general. It's not even like CW quality, it's below that because it feels even more fake, if that makes sense to anyone. But I do feel like Henry is an important character in this season. He's a big reason why the Lydia conflict becomes so interesting and important. He's an important character to the people around him that we do like, and that's usually a way to get the audience to like that character too. Speaking of which, let's talk about Magna's group once again. The writers do their best to give each character some personality and integrate them with our group of survivors in an organic way, and I feel like with this season they actually do a fine job with that. But one of these characters shines far brighter than the rest, and that, of course, is Connie. Say what you want about how unrealistic it is for a deaf person to survive the zombie apocalypse, it makes for some good drama, which at the end of the day is what The Walking Dead is. And a big reason why the audience grew to love and care for Connie above all the others is because of her connection with Daryl. Later on in this season, Daryl goes on a mission to save Henry, and Connie insists that she go with him. Daryl is the lone wolf and doesn't want her to come at first, but throughout their journey, Daryl better learns how to communicate with her, and this mission ends up being a strong bonding point between these two characters for a friendship that lasts to the end of the series. And once again, you pair new characters with old characters that we know and love, get the old character to care for the new character, and it's a very easy way for the audience to start caring for that person too. But you see, Connie is really the only member of this new group to do that. Later on, some other attempts are made at integrating the others, but Connie, in my opinion, is really the only one that sticks, and a big part of that is because of this season and her friendship with Daryl. How it seems like they had a plan for this relationship to grow organically and actually had a plan for Connie. This whole storyline also leads us to the Daryl versus Beta scene, which is a pretty cool scene. In the final part of the season, Lydia officially joins the group and everybody more or less accepts her as one of their own. And with the fair coming at the kingdom, this giant event that is supposed to reunite all the communities since their implosion because of Rick's departure, all seems well. So let's flash back to sometime after the disappearance of Rick, with Daryl searching for Rick's body and a pregnant Michonne in the episode Scars. Now, this is an episode that I'm not too sure why it only has a 7.9, because I think this is a pretty great, but also pretty horrific episode of television, in the same way that The Grove is a pretty great, but pretty horrific episode of television. But this episode answers some questions we had about how the communities broke up in the first place, and of course, why Daryl and Michonne have those scars. I'm usually not a big fan of flashback episodes whatsoever. I think they're generally a lazy way to interrupt the pacing of a story and just explain a lot of unnecessary details, but with this episode, I make an exception. Maybe because it's a flashback episode that is so deep into a story and it comes after a significant time jump, but overall, I think that this is a great episode of The Walking Dead. Not too sure what everybody's gripe with it is, so if you don't like this episode, please let me know why that is in the comments below. So after what is a really heavy and dark episode of the show, we move on to the next episode. Surely this episode will be much lighter since it's about the happy fair that they've all been planning for the past 7 episodes. Let's see here. Oh right, this episode is called The Calm Before. There's a false sense of happiness covering this whole episode. All members of the group are on good terms again, they sign the treaty, and it's just like old times. The scenes feel incredibly uplifting and joyous, but something just doesn't feel right. It reminds me quite a bit of the final few episodes of The Clone Wars. They seemingly won the battle and captured Maul. They're all celebrating and the tone is uplifting, but the music doesn't match the scenes whatsoever. It's warning you that it's not over and that something drastic is coming, and that's exactly what The Calm Before does too. The Whisperers interfere with the fair, Alpha blending in and talking to our characters, and if you've read the comics, or at least know who dies in the comics, there's a ton of misdirection in this episode for who is actually going to be the Pike victims. The reveals are slow and methodical, the music is heart-wrenching and horrific, and of course, Carol can never be happy in this series, so she loses yet another child who looks at her as their mother. Regardless of how everybody feels about Henry, his death is tragic and is the mic drop death of this episode and season. This episode proved that The Walking Dead still had it, and while all of these deaths are shocking, there's actually proper setup for them in this episode. And it feels like there's more of a reason for all these people dying, particularly Henry, than the deaths in the past where they just needed to kill somebody for the sake of shock value. This episode deserves to be on the top 10 episodes list, and this episode caps off what has been an emotionally draining season. And now we want to see just how our group comes back from this. Oh wait, there's still another episode. The last episode, titled The Storm, is supposed to be both literal and metaphorical, although it kind of feels more literal because there's actually a snowstorm in this episode, which is entirely new for The Walking Dead. Anytime it's been winter, they just skip right over it with a time jump, so this was new territory for The Walking Dead, and anytime that happens, you gotta give them credit for at least trying. What I really like about the finale is how traumatized the group is from the events of the previous episode. Carol blames Lydia for what happened to Henry, even though she knows it's not really her fault, but she can't really help but feel she's to blame anyways. There's no one to really take the reins and say, alright, it's time for payback, so everybody just kind of follows the rules that Alpha has set in place until they can't do that anymore and have to venture into their territory. And even without seeing them, the Whisperers feel very threatening. You don't know if they're watching, how all of this is going to play out, and if there's one thing that this season really got right, it's that horror aspect, because the Whisperers really do feel like a major threat. Negan also takes on a bigger role in this finale, once again being an ass around the group and getting under the skin of everybody that he can, but his true colors come out when he risks his own life to save Judith. And again, a lot of this feels this way because of the absence of Rick Grimes. If Rick was here, one way or another, he'd have a plan of revenge, a plan to keep peace, whatever it would be, depending on what version of Rick we would get, but without him, the group is kind of aimless. Maybe my love for Rick kind of clouds my judgment on the rest of the characters in this season, but I've always viewed this season with the lens of, what would Rick do if he were here? And because he's not, it makes the characters and their decisions that much more impactful. Again, taking the comics and what happens there out of it, I feel like the show version of Rick would have handled this entire Whisperer situation very differently. So without him around, without a concrete leader around, the season plays out much differently because of it. He might only be in 5 episodes of the season, but his absence plays a much larger role than anything else. But you can only go so far with the what would Rick do lens, and they can't exactly keep that up for the rest of the series, so somebody needs to step up and take charge, and that's exactly what happens in Season 10. I'm gonna give The Walking Dead Season 9 an 8.6 out of 10. Season 10 has always been a bit of a weird one for me because in some ways it continues the trend from Season 9 of having these really big moments and delivering some really great and impactful emotional moments, and in other ways it reverts back to the Season 7 and 8 days where the pacing is so incredibly terrible and the characters make some really nonsensical decisions to the point that I'm brought out of the story. This season also does something that The Walking Dead hadn't done in a long time, and that's tell one complete story over the course of the season. In the seasons past, they usually break the seasons up into A and B because the first half is one storyline and the second half is another, and we'd gotten used to seeing that from Season 4 onwards, but this season breaks that trend, for better or worse. The season starts off on a pretty good note, with the group focusing on fighting and then having to traverse into the Whisperer territory to stop the fire caused by the satellite crash. Stuff like this definitely shows the progression of time and how stuff like this would definitely happen years and years into the apocalypse, but even just saying those words out loud, a satellite crashing into the woods, kind of makes it sound like they're grasping for straws at anything by this point in the show, and honestly, they kind of were. But it could be worse. If this happened in Fear the Walking Dead, they'd probably use the technology from the satellite to make some sort of like a mech suit or something absolutely insane. But then in the second episode, for some reason, we need to hear the complete backstory of the Whisperers as some sort of attempt to, I don't know, humanize Alpha and Beta. I don't really think this episode or this story is needed at all. In Season 9, we get to see the start of how Alpha became who she is, because it served Lydia's story and served to further make us care for her character, but we don't need to sympathize with the Whisperers. These are insane people going to extreme lengths to survive in this world. They've killed our characters, they're villains, and unlike with Negan or even the Governor, I don't think getting to know these characters and who they are at their core is doing any sort of service other than making them not all that scary anymore. And I praise Season 9 for bringing the horror back to The Walking Dead, but Season 10 tries its hardest to make the Whisperers not all that scary or even threatening. Episode 3 really introduces us to who the main character of this season is going to be, and that's Carol. Now, this is where I have to give the show and the writing its props. I'm a big Carol fan, always was, always will be, and I think with Rick being gone and this show really going off script when it comes to adapting the comics, particularly starting with this season, Carol is the perfect person to step up and take charge, because that's totally within the realm of her character and the decisions that she's made. This episode really shows us how affected she is by the Whisperers and how they're really this sort of personification of all of her past trauma, with her seeing the ghosts of all the dead children she's mommied over the years. This season really propels Carol into the center stage to make her and Alpha the two opposite sides of the same coin. And in some ways, this is done really successfully, and in other ways, not so much. We also get to see another character elevated to a primetime slot with Negan. This season, especially the first half of it, tries really hard to show us how much time has passed in this world. The communities are all breaking down, supplies are running low, the satellite falls out of the sky, and I think a lot of this is done to continue differentiating the show from past seasons and give a reason to have some more drama, but I think all of this, whether it was intended or not, also goes to show how long it's been since Negan was the big bad of the show. It's only been 3 seasons since he was introduced, but the in-world time is so much longer than that, and I think that's a really big selling point in this first half of the season in order to propel Negan to having a bigger role. Season 9 started his sort of redemption arc by showing us how good he is with Judith, and with this season they continued that trend. Father Gabriel gets so fed up about needing fighters, so he yells at Aaron and says that Negan is right here, just use him, which goes to show how short-handed they really are, but also how much time has passed. But making people like Negan was still going to be an incredibly tall task to a lot of the audience. I still see comments to this day of people saying that they don't like Negan, that they never bought into his redemption, and they could never forgive him. And honestly, I do think that's fair. The show went to extreme lengths to make us hate him, and we bought it. So when you try to buy that villain card back from the audience, sometimes it's not gonna work. Personally, I'm always a big fan of the redemption arc. Jaime Lannister is my favorite Game of Thrones character, Snape is my favorite Harry Potter character, Anakin Skywalker, my favorite Star Wars character. I'm incredibly easily sold on the redemption arc because I just find these types of characters so interesting, especially the more morally gray ones like Negan. But the way the show goes about everything is by introducing the character Brandon, who idolizes the past Negan, and we see how this version of Negan is not that guy anymore. He even ends up killing Brandon, which is really a sort of symbolic way of him killing his past self and his past life. And the way Negan is used in this season is also really smart. The writers knew that Negan wasn't going to be this highly trusted guy. The audience was going to be very cautious when it came to his decisions, so for him to escape and go join the Whisperers were meant to still hate this guy and maybe even feel a bit betrayed by his decisions because he was just starting to come around to being one of the good guys. Meanwhile, there's this big B-plot with people being sick at Alexandria and Siddiq wondering what on earth is going on. This whole plot goes on for a while, and it's honestly one of the reasons why the pacing from the first part of the season is dragged down, but it does have a pretty great ending, maybe? We find out that there's been a Whisperer infiltrator amongst the group, and he ends up killing Siddiq. A great twist, absolutely, but the death of Siddiq really doesn't sit right with me, and I know that's the same for a lot of people. Siddiq's character will always be tied together with Carl's death. Carl literally ended up dying saving Siddiq, and obviously his death didn't go over well with the majority of fans, so when this twist first happens, you're kind of like, oh wow, that's so crazy. But then you really think about Siddiq more, and you're kind of just like, well, okay, what was the point of all that? Siddiq never really did anything significant on the show. He was a side character who got one or two moments to shine, but when a character like Carl dies to save Siddiq, you'd expect Siddiq to have a pretty big role going forward. You'd expect Siddiq to be the man who develops a cure, or nothing, I mean, not exactly that, but something like that at the very least. Personally, I think what he should have done was save Judith. I think if Judith was like on her deathbed and Siddiq was the only man who could save her or something like that, then after that he ends up having this exact same death, then his character wouldn't feel so pointless. Sure, he ended up living for another 10 years because of Carl. He was a much needed and well-respected member of Alexandria to the characters, but from an audience perspective, Siddiq was a glorified background character, didn't really have any big storylines of his own until this one, which ended up with him dying. It just never sat right with me, and still doesn't to this day. As we go further towards the mid-season finale, we see the writers really hammering home this idea that Carol and Alpha are two sides of the same coin. That in some alternate reality, Carol ended up becoming exactly like Alpha in an effort to protect her kid and had this warped mindset. And like I said before, I really like this concept. I think it works really well, but not when it comes at the cost of the characters themselves. There's this big group out on a mission when suddenly Carol sees Alpha. So what does Carol do? She runs directly after Alpha and into a freaking cave that might as well have a sign over it that says, "Welcome to my trap." She gets everybody into some danger for the mandatory mid-season finale cliffhanger. This is stupid writing, this is a stupid plotline, and I even like the next episode. I think the episode Squeeze does a really good job at making you feel claustrophobic, as it should with a title like that. And a lot of the tension built up in this episode is really well done. We end up losing, but not really, two characters in the process, which would make you think that Carol takes all of this on herself and that this is all her fault, and they kind of do that, but ultimately just forget about it because nobody actually died in this scene. Lauren Ridloff just went away to go and film Eternals, which I mean, good for her, but that movie was just as terrible as this whole plotline. This episode also gives us the infamous, scene in the woods with Negan and Alpha, and how do I talk about this one? Let's just say Negan was really the person taking one for the team here.
He just took 1 or 6 or 7 for the team!
If you still don't like him after everything he goes through this season, or at least still don't feel like he's sacrificed enough to be part of the group, why don't you just go ahead and rewatch this scene for me. The second half of the season goes the all-out war route once again, but thankfully there hasn't been guns in this show for 2 seasons, so this war is leaps and bounds better than Season 8's war. There also isn't that many battles, which might sound like a knock on this season, but it's actually the complete opposite. Season 8 had so many different meaningless battles and action sequences that it just got boring, but in this season they actually take the proper time to build up the battles and add some real stakes and tension to them. The episode Morningstar and Walk With Us actually give us one of the greatest battles in all of The Walking Dead. I remember there was a lot of comparisons with this battle to the episode The Long Night in Season 8 of Game of Thrones, and I remember seeing the comments about how never in a million years did I think a battle would be better in The Walking Dead than it was in Game of Thrones, but here we are. This battle was mainly focused on tactics and how they could win with such small numbers. It brings a lot of their training in the first episode back into play here, and watching these episodes again, I was actually surprised by how great they actually were. After the battle, in what is the highest rated episode of the season, outside of Here's Negan, but I don't really count that one, more on that later, we see what Negan was actually up to this entire time when he captures Lydia. The scenes are filmed and edited as though he's bringing Alpha to her, when in reality it was all one big trap so that way Negan could kill Alpha. A plan that was all orchestrated by Carol. Now, I love all of this. Like I said earlier, Carol was always the one who stepped up to make the bold choices that others couldn't. She killed Karen and David because they were getting everybody sick. She single-handedly took out Terminus. She showed no mercy to the wolves. And for Rick to be gone and somebody needing to step up and make tough decisions for everybody, it was only natural that that person would be Carol. Her letting Negan escape so that way he can eventually kill Alpha was such a big brain move because everybody, including some of the audience, believed that Negan really did go and join up with the Whisperers, even though everything we know about Negan now says that he wouldn't do that. But also, buddy, you probably could have killed her here and saved everybody a lot of time. I think this is a great twist in the story. I think it works really well for Carol. I think it even makes Carol's dumb decision to go and get trapped make more sense because eventually Alpha would end up getting trapped herself. Alright, so Michonne is in this season. Kinda. You can tell Denai Guerrero was really checked out early in this season, so they added this whole storyline with Virgil. Now, I'm very happy to finally be making a video where I can talk about this episode with the context of what comes after it. For so long, this episode was talked about a ton because it had clues to Rick being alive, and there was this strange caravan of people that Angela Kang said would be really important. And all of these clues definitely led somewhere, and this caravan of people were important, I guess. This episode actually is a really good send-off for Michonne. We got to see some of the what-ifs in this universe after Michonne starts tripping balls, which goes to show how different people can be when they run with a different group. Yet another point to Negan's potential redemption arc in this season, and I think this episode did a pretty good job of closing Michonne's character for the time being. All that being said, she still abandoned her kids in the middle of a war with the Whisperers, and nobody even bats an eye when she's gone. It doesn't make any sense. I don't care how people try to chop it up and explain her decisions. This is clearly just done because Denai wanted out, but I'll never believe that Michonne would actually do this, and yet I have to, because it's what she did. Eugene has also had a B-plot this season, talking to some girl over the radio, so he takes a squad of people to go and meet with his apocalyptic Tinder date, and we meet Princess. Now, when Princess was first introduced, she had the Jar Jar Binks effect on me. I thought this character was so over the top and unfunny that I just couldn't stand when she was on screen, but not really with this season, but with the next season, this character definitely grew on me. So when I rewatched this scene and her introduction, I didn't actually hate it all that much. This whole storyline introduces us to the Commonwealth, which obviously leads us to the primary storyline of Season 11. After Negan's big reveal and his intentions are disclosed to the group, we get to the final battle of the Whisperers, who are now led by Beta. Now, these episodes were coming out in March and April of 2020, and for those of you who don't remember, people thought that we were soon going to be reenacting the entire plot of The Walking Dead in our life, so the season finale, or episode 16, didn't actually air until October 1st, and it was just a one-episode thing, because the episodes after that didn't air until February. So we went from weekly Walking Dead episodes to one episode randomly placed in October, and then a few more episodes in early 2021. I obviously understand why this was done, but looking back at the release dates of the episodes, it's just so random, and I think that's funny. But the finale episode is actually pretty great. We see Maggie make this triumphant return with cool new ninja-looking characters. Daryl and Negan have this climactic showdown against Beta, and Lydia ends up saving Carol and bringing her back, which is a great ending arc for both of these characters. And with Negan part of the group, but Maggie back, things are about to get spicy in Season 11. Or, I guess, Season 10, Part 3. The extra 6 episodes that were added at the end of the season because of COVID really brings the quality of the season overall down by quite a lot. But I've also never really looked at these episodes as part of Season 10's story. The first episode gives us some hints about what's to come in Season 11. The next episode introduces Leah, so I guess that's important. But everything afterwards, while some of it's good, just doesn't really connect to anything whatsoever. It's weird, almost like this universe has a spin-off show for one-off episodes and storylines. And sure, Tales wasn't out yet, but these 6 episodes so easily could have just been the first episode of that. And honestly, not all of these episodes involving setting up Season 11 are all that needed. I'm going to be completely honest here and say that I didn't watch any of these episodes again. Once was enough for me. I have seen the Aaron and Gabriel episode and Here's Negan a few times. Those are 2 actually really good episodes, but this just doesn't scream Season 10 to me. Here's Negan is, of course, a fantastic episode and really one of the only episodes that worked using this COVID formula, so I'll give this one its credit, but all the others are take it or leave it, but mostly leave it. So for Season 10, if I'm including the 6 extra COVID episodes, then this season gets like a 7.1, but without them, I'd give this season a 7.8. Not as great as Season 9, it does have some pretty great highs, but a lot of this season is lows and stupid character writing. Season 11 is even more of a mixed bag for me than Season 10 was. I've seen a lot of people who say that this is the worst season of the show, and I don't agree with that. I also have a bit of a soft spot when it comes to this season because while this season was airing was when I first started making Walking Dead videos. My channel was really starting to gain some traction because of those videos and the conversations around Season 11. So do I have a bit of a bias when it comes to this season? Yes, I do, but I still don't think that this season is nearly as bad as people claim it is. I think what really brings this season down, for me at least, is the final part. But before I go over that, let's talk about the beginning of the season. Right at the start, we see that this season, they're going back to the roots of the show and the zombie apocalypse genre in general with the use of guns. We hadn't seen our characters fight primarily with guns in a really long time, so this opening infiltration of the military base kind of sets the tone for how the season is going to go in regards to the weapons they use. But these first 2 episodes, Acheron Parts 1 and 2, are actually both really great. We're introduced to the problem at Alexandria with a lack of resources. Maggie's absence is acknowledged in a really great way since she knows about where to find more resources in her time away from the show. So this group goes out on an adventure, Fellowship of the Ring style, and there's an enormous elephant in the room because Negan and Maggie are on this mission together. There's an excellent interaction where Negan says that Maggie brought him here to die, he says something bad about Glenn, and Daryl punches him, yet nobody's around to help him up. This is a stark contrast to the last time Daryl punched Negan around a group of people, where everybody came to Negan's side and Daryl was the one on the ground. I love this kind of symmetry in storytelling, and The Walking Dead actually does this quite a bit without calling attention to it. Like if Daryl had said, "No one's here to help you up this time," or something like that, it would have ruined the moment. But it works in this story, and then when you realize it's a callback to a previous moment in another time with very different power dynamics, it makes for that much greater of a scene, and I honestly applaud the writers for holding out on a line of dialogue to connect the 2 scenes. Let the audience do that for themselves. Let people like me spell it out to people if they didn't realize it for themselves. Getting through the subway proves to be a challenge, and people get split up, they get left behind, and this whole sequence is really good. These 2 opening episodes are probably the best opening episodes since Season 7, but then we're introduced to the Reapers. And these guys, at first, are absolutely terrifying. In this first really strangely filmed and lighted scene, the Reapers seem absolutely unstoppable. A group of trained killers in the apocalypse is actually a really great enemy for our group to go against, and something different than we've seen before. As this storyline progresses, the Reapers get insanely nerfed. Seriously, the patch notes must have been crazy, but for a little while, this group is terrifying with a scary theme song, and I really felt scared for our group. And just as the Fellowship does, this group splits up, and it honestly makes for some really great scenes and dynamics. If you remember back to when I was talking about Season 7, I said that it would have been far more interesting if Daryl had just joined Negan as a secret double agent, and it would have been far smarter for him to do that too. And it seems in the years that followed, Daryl got much smarter, since that is exactly what he does, and he joins the Reapers. There was never a time where I thought, oh, maybe Daryl really is buying into what the Reapers are offering, and I don't think we're supposed to, but there's also Leah, whose main purpose is for Daryl to be conflicted until he tries to bring her over to the group's side. I also never really bought into this romance at all. It seems weird that they had this perfectly set up love interest for Daryl with Connie, but introduced somebody else entirely random to actually be Daryl's love interest, only for that to fade into absolutely nothing. The storyline doesn't even really hinge on the fact that Daryl has feelings for Leah, and if it does, then they do a pretty crap job at showing that, so I don't really know. This whole thing just feels really forced to me. I remember a lot of people were really into this Pope guy as a villain, and while I thought there was definitely some potential there, I also just never really saw what other people did. Some people thought he was this extremely menacing figure, and maybe it's because I know a guy in my life who looks exactly like this and is anything but menacing, but I just personally never saw it. Another great group paired together is Maggie and Negan. They of course have some bad blood and history, and even just an episode before that, Negan left Maggie for dead, so pairing them together and forcing them to work together was a really great plan. I'm not sure if this pairing is great enough for, I don't know, an entire spin-off show, but it worked really well here. Negan saying that if he could go back, he would have just killed everybody seems entirely unexpected because he's had his redemption, but it also feels far more truthful than saying he regrets what he did, because he didn't know Glenn, he didn't know Abraham. I'm sure he probably thinks they were fine people, but his life was absolutely set before he came across Rick and the group. So I understand where he's coming from, and this makes for a really great scene. There's also everything going on at the Commonwealth, which seems entirely obvious that this is where the whole storyline is going, and this is where they're gonna get all the resources that they need, so in a way, it makes the other storyline with the Reapers a little pointless, but that story is also far more interesting than the Commonwealth is at the start of the season. The season does promote Yumiko to a more prominent role since she has her own storyline at the Commonwealth and is one of the first characters there and has a brother who lives there, and I'm all for promoting different characters and giving them their own storylines, so I like this change. Whenever I see Yumiko, I have a hard time remembering that she wasn't one of the characters introduced in Season 11 because she does very little up until this point in the show. But what we see out of the Commonwealth is really cool. An actual functioning society with all the supplies they could ever need and people living normal lives. I feel like this is actually a great ending location for the series because this is what they were trying to build towards at first. But I do think as the season goes on, some of the more thematic storylines and plots don't really land all that well, but I'll get to that stuff in a bit. There's also some other filler stuff going on at Alexandria and the Hilltop with some remnant whisperers and Carol chasing a horse that got loose, but all of this is done as an afterthought. I said Season 10 kind of went out of its way to slow down on the horror, and I was disappointed by that, so Season 11 ramps it back up with the episode On the Inside. This episode is honestly spectacular and takes full advantage of the possibilities and practicalities of having a deaf person in the zombie apocalypse. Connie and Virgil's encounters in this house of horrors, meeting the feral people, is honestly some of the scariest stuff in the entire series. And honestly, the implication of feral people is so much scarier than I think a lot of people realize. Society has been gone for so long that these people are literally feral now. They're not survivors like the group is. They're not even adapters like the Whisperers. They just completely regressed in all facets of their life. In a world where things like the Commonwealth exist, feral people is honestly so crazy and doesn't get talked about nearly enough in this show. Towards the mid-season finale, I really liked how Negan teaches the others the ways of the Whisperers and how that helps them defeat the Reapers. It's one former villain using another former group of villains' tactics on a new group of villains, and I think that's really cool. There's of course the mandatory mid-season finale cliffhanger, and this is just a really bad cliffhanger with all the rockets being fired. Like, this is maybe an end of an episode cliffhanger, but not a mid-season finale cliffhanger. Our characters have survived far worse odds than this, and then when the next episode comes out, surprise, surprise, none of the main characters died from it. Negan's words had a huge effect on Maggie, so she tries to kill all the remaining Reapers, proving that Negan was actually right all along and that he and Maggie aren't so different after all. There's also this rainstorm going on at Alexandria that raises the stakes there. It's a bit of a cheap thrill, but it also works. This is also the episode that Virgil just straight up disappears. He goes upstairs and is never heard from or talked about ever again. The rest of the group is also introduced to the Commonwealth, and then we see a few months later where it seems Maggie is opposing Lance Hornsby and Daryl is on the side of the Commonwealth. Now that is a mid-season finale cliffhanger, and a really good one at that. But wait a minute, this is the mid-season premiere. No Other Way, by all accounts, should have been the mid-season finale, and I hated how The Walking Dead would always do this by completing the storyline of the first half of the season in the mid-season premiere, just to have a big reset afterwards. I gave props to Season 10 for kind of breaking that mold a little bit and telling one complete story over the course of the season, but Season 11 goes right back to its roots and its manipulative viewership rating ways. When our group first settles into the Commonwealth, it seems everybody is looking for any kind of crack in the system or some sort of evil ruler, and honestly, there isn't a whole lot there. Pamela Milton isn't this evil dictator. Mercer is a bit scary, but he's ultimately a good dude as well. Sebastian's just a little brat. And Lance Hornsby, well, let's talk about him. I think that Lance Hornsby is actually a really great villain with a lot of wasted potential. He gives me vice principal vibes, where they act like they're your friend, but in reality they're just scheming to get you in trouble or catch you in some sort of lie. I really liked every scene with Lance and really wanted to figure out more about what he was up to. In Eugene's detective episode, which was directed by Abraham himself, fun fact, we do see a few flaws and cracks in the system where Stephanie was faking her love for Eugene, and how the Commonwealth was doing their part by protecting themselves from outsiders. And honestly, you can't really blame them. This sort of place only works if you let the right people in, which is what they had been doing for a really long time. There's also another actually excellent twist where the real Stephanie was Mercer's sister Max. I thought this reveal and all the subtle moments that led up to it were genuinely really great, and I for one was shocked at this twist, and I thought it worked incredibly well. After this, we get a really great 2-episode stretch with Warlords and the Rotten Core. Again, I think these 2 episodes are fantastic and by far the best 2 episodes of this season. I thought the writing here and the different perspectives of events going on was incredibly well written and edited, and these episodes saw the return of Negan, who now has a new wife and a kid on the way. I'm sure this will be incredibly important in any future episodes and potential spin-offs involving Negan. Here we see the true colors of Lance Hornsby, and that cliffhanger scene comes to fruition, as well as the evil Toby, who's like that really mean math teacher if Lance Hornsby is the vice principal. Going into the second third season break, there's a lot of things being set up for the third and final stretch of the Walking Dead episodes. Lance now has it out for our characters, and this puts everybody at the Commonwealth in danger. Oceanside is maybe gonna die if Two-Face's coin flips the wrong way. There's a bunch of shady stuff going around with people disappearing in the Commonwealth. Pamela and Lance Hornsby talk about other higher powers coming into play, and all of this really led a lot of us to believe that the third and final part was going to be absolutely insane. This was the time that I and so many others made a ton of theory videos about what these things could potentially mean. Were these higher powers that Hornsby talked about referring to the CRM? Was this list of missing people actually a list of people that had been traded to the CRM? Could all of this tie into Rick potentially coming back and helping our group destroy the monarchy at the Commonwealth? A lot of these connections seem to actually make a lot of sense, and when there were already confirmed spin-offs about Daryl and Negan and Maggie, it seemed that this final stretch of episodes would finally bring the CRM into the main show as a sort of springboard for future projects. I wasn't entirely sure how things would go. I made a number of theory videos, but I was almost certain that the CRM would show up in these final episodes. And that didn't happen. I remember back when I did a ranking for the seasons, all of season 11 hadn't come out yet, but I thought that the first two parts were actually really good, so I figured that sort of quality would continue into the final part, but that also didn't happen. Now, does this final part being bad directly tie into my theories on it being wrong? No, it doesn't. And if anybody went into the final part of the season without any sort of fan theories in their heads, they probably had a much better experience. But I know that I and so many others had a lot of expectations for this final part of the season, and our experiences weren't that great. Looking back on it and watching through these episodes again, I understand that they were trying to finish the story that they had with the elements and the characters that they had in place, so in that regard, I accept this final part of the season a lot more now than I did back when it was airing. However, a lot of this final part, especially the final episode, was also just there to set up future spin-offs. So if that was the case, I feel like they could have done a lot more to actually set up those spin-offs here. You had the comics to go on, sure, but by this point in the show, it was basically only being loosely adapted. The CRM doesn't exist in the comics, and I truly think that they fumbled quite a bit with this ending. But again, let's take all those fan theory expectations away and judge these episodes solely on what they are now. There's still a huge number of problems with the story. Like how, I don't know, for some reason there's variant walkers with absolutely zero explanation. There's an entire episode dedicated to variants, and it's how they eventually break into the Commonwealth, but this isn't explained whatsoever. One of the variants picks up a knife, and I thought, oh boy, that's gonna be important. This walker's gonna stab an important character. But nope, it's not. We never see that walker again. Lance Hornsby was this really intriguing villain. I can't wait to see what he does next. Oh, Daryl and Carol just decide to kill him randomly in the woods? Okay. A bunch of the kids and people are being taken, being sent away to these secret special places. Oh man, all this has to lead to some sort of big reveal or some ultra dramatic death. Oh, nope, that doesn't happen. There's no big reveal, and they just get everybody back who was taken away. Everything that's set up has such astronomically unsatisfying endings, and it makes me furious. There's so much buildup and suspense with the Commonwealth over the course of the season, and everything just kind of flutters out by the end. The series finale is a pretty good episode. It wraps up the storyline of the Commonwealth nicely, sets up a lot of interesting plot lines for the next season, and hey, it looks like Rick and Michonne will be back in the next season too. Alright, let's go! Next season must focus on the CRM, and there will be this all-out duel between the CRM and the Commonwealth. This is gonna be so awesome, I can't... Wait, that's it?
That's it?
Is this a good season finale? Yes, it is. Is this a good series finale? Absolutely not. I've had this opinion since the finale aired, and I remember making a video about the finale saying all this, and since I was the guy who was always really positive about The Walking Dead, the comments absolutely turned on me instantly because I said it wasn't a good series finale. But as time has gone on, we've gotten multiple shows and seasons and spin-offs. I think that this has become the more popular opinion. There's a few character arcs that are closed, like how Father Gabriel ends up opening the gates to the people to let them in and live, the complete opposite of how his character was introduced. I think that's really great, but all the main characters just didn't get proper endings. Daryl leaves to go looking for Rick. Maggie talks about a bigger world out there. Rick and Michonne have a scene literally showing us that those stories aren't finished. This is not a series finale. People are gonna binge this series in the years that follow and be super disappointed by this episode because it just means that they have seasons upon seasons of other shows that they now have to watch too. Maybe some people will enjoy that, but I'm betting a majority of people won't. I think 2/3 of this season is great. I like the mission against the Reapers, I liked the introduction to the Commonwealth and a lot of the reveals and episodes that contained, but the final 8 episodes just didn't do it for me. So because of that, I'm gonna give season 11 an okay score of like a 6.8 out of 10. So I know that this video is coming a little bit later than I would have liked, and because of that, I want to do a little something extra here and give you my full rankings of the seasons. A lot of people have been asking for an updated ranking of the seasons, and while all the ratings are obviously in this video, here's the full list. Coming in last place, we have Season 8. The season is all around bad, save for a really great character arc for Rick Grimes. Killing off Carl was the biggest mistake the show ever made. All of the action and editing and pacing for the season was just really bad. The season should have and could have been a slam dunk, but it was quite simply a mess right from the very first episode. Next up, we have Season 7. The season is just about as bad as Season 8, but there are a few actually good episodes. The first half of the season moves at a snail's pace. The boomerang storytelling was at its worst this season, so it just feels like barely anything happened. The final episode gave us a glimpse at what the actual war was going to look like in Season 8, and it was not a very good first impression. Next up, Season 11. The final season of the show is just unfortunate to have this low of a ranking because you always want to go out on a high note, but the show just didn't do that. The first 2 parts of the season actually aren't bad at all, and I still quite like them, but the last part just failed to live up to final season expectations, and when the last thing you see doesn't leave a good impression, then the rest becomes forgettable too. Number 7, Season 10. I think the season gets a pretty bad rap. No, it's not amazing, but it does do a lot of things right. A lot of the big climactic moments actually land pretty well, but there's also a lot of questionable writing choices, and of course, those final COVID episodes really bring this season down. Number 6, Season 3. Now, a lot of people might think that this is strange to have this season this low, and I was pretty surprised this is where it was on my rankings, but it's what the numbers I gave each season said, so here it is. The first half of the season is really great, but the second part, especially the finale, doesn't really continue that quality, and it just kinda ends the season out on a flat note. Still a phenomenal season of TV, don't get me wrong. Next up, we have Season 9, outshining Season 3 by 0.1 of a point. I think that the comeback that Season 9 gave the show was incredible after its 2 worst seasons, and Rick Grimes leaving the show in this season was a big hurdle that they had to go through, but they took advantage of it and added a lot of that to the story because the groups were kind of aimless without Rick. And with a major time jump, they got to kind of reset and give the show a new beginning, which it desperately needed. Number 4, Season 2. At one point, this was everybody's least favorite season, because when you compare it to Season 1, sure, this season is much slower, but it was also much more of a character drama set in the apocalypse than just your typical zombie survival show. Some people liked that, some didn't, but with how the show has aged, I think a lot of people look back much more fondly on this season, myself included. In our number 3 spot, I'm cheating a little bit here because it's season 5 and season 1. They're tied for the number 3 spot because I gave both of them a 9 out of 10. The first season did such a great job setting up this world and the characters. In hindsight, I think the CDC plotline kind of hurt the show in the long run, but it's still not a bad episode or plotline. Season 5 starts off with one of, if not the greatest episode and storyline with Terminus and the termites, then kind of loses it a bit with the Beth story, but bounces back with the introduction of Alexandria and gave the show an entirely different feeling, and I loved that. Our runner-up goes to Season 4. While I was a fan of The Walking Dead before this season, this was when I took that jump to super fan territory. I thought the first half, like murder mystery vibe, was really interesting. Then Too Far Gone happened, which is obviously one of the best episodes in the show, and I thought the back half of this season is the best 8-episode stretch in the entire show. And at number 1, we have Season 6. I know that this isn't the perfect season. In fact, I know this isn't even the greatest season in general. There's a lot of issues here, but I remember being at my peak for my love of The Walking Dead when this season came out. I'd watch every episode twice, I was super invested in the story, and I just have the best time watching these episodes out of every season. The Walking Dead has and always will be a very special show to me, whether it's the memories I have watching it with friends and family, the conversations I had online when it was airing, or, of course, making videos about the show that really propelled this channel to what it is today. I will always love The Walking Dead. Even the bad parts of it, yes, even Season 8, as much as I go on about how bad it is. This show and all of you watching these videos are what gave me this dream job of being able to write and talk about my favorite things, and I'll always be incredibly grateful and surprised that so many people care about what I have to say about this show. So while I now make videos on mostly other non-Walking Dead things, I'll always continue making Walking Dead videos. I know that a lot of you are here solely for these videos, and I'll continue making them until The Walking Dead stops or gets rebooted. And even then, I'll probably still make videos when that happens. This has been an incredibly long journey, going through the show, taking extensive notes on it, and sharing it with you all. And whether you've been here from the beginning when I started posting these videos, or this is the first video of mine that you're watching, thank you for staying to the end. Thank you for coming to this part and skipping around, whatever you did. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for all the support, and I will see you all in the next one.